So maybe we can start off, you can tell me your story and go from there in terms of how you...
Okay, well, my story is different from many people's stories because I was a child of about 3 and a half. I say about 3 and a half because I found my birth certificate in 1989, and so I know exactly how old I am now, where I was born in February 35, whereas the birthday that I use, I was born in February 36. The birthday that I really was born was December 35, so there isn't that much of a difference, but I didn't find that till 1989, just 10 years ago. My story is different because 1.5 million children perished and I survived. That makes a big difference. Also, most children who survived were in hiding, and I wound up in the concentration camps, slave labor camps, ghettos, concentration camps. My story is also different because any child who lost their parents, they were lost. Whereas every time I lost somebody else came along and adopted me. And finally, by the age of 9 and a half, I was adopted by somebody who brought me from Sweden, DP camp, to the United States. And then shortly after we got here, she died, so I was adopted by an American family. When I was adopted by the American family, I got new parents, new grandparents, aunts and uncles. Nobody biologically related, but it started. I also had an education where most survivors didn't, because by the time they came, they had to sort of fend for themselves. I was born in Piotrków, which is a city not far away from Lodz, and it was the first ghetto that was started in Poland. And we lived in the Jewish area, which meant that we were able to stay in the apartment that we had, but other people came in and it got very crowded, and a lot of people died of starvation and sickness and the stories that you know of. When they weren't dying fast enough, there was an action, a roundup, and the first action was against women and children, and my mother and my 2 brothers and I were amongst those people. We were herded through the streets into a large room, which turned out to be the synagogue. I've been back to the synagogue since also. It's now a library, but there are still Magen Davids on the lanterns outside, so you can see how it had been a synagogue. And inside, if you know enough to ask the librarian to pull open a curtain, you can still see where the Aron Kodesh, where the bullet was. Well, we were in that room. Thousands of people were herded into that area, and there was a man on the other side of the door. The men who were legal, who were working, were not rounded up. And he beckoned to me and he told me to run. And I don't know how it was possible that a little child would leave her mother and run away, but I did. And the soldier at the door, for some reason, allowed me to run. I guess he figured how far would a little child get, and how, if he doesn't kill me, somebody else will. That was the last time I saw my mother and my brothers. That whole transport of thousands of people were sent to Treblinka, where they were gassed and burnt. This man took me back to my father. What was my father going to do with me? I wasn't really allowed to be there as a child, as a girl. For a while he had me under the cellar, under the ground with some other people. And then when it was no longer feasible, he dressed me as a boy. And I went to work with the men. And I got away with it. I don't know how. I certainly didn't look that much like a man, and I certainly wasn't big enough, but I got away with it. And we worked in a glass factory for many hours a day. As children, we had to carry buckets of water because you needed water for glass blowing, and there was sand, and it was very, very hot, and we were always tired, we were always hungry, and we were always scared, and there were always vicious dogs there. I mean, I don't have to go into all the details, I suppose, but just to tell you that life in the factory was very difficult, but every time I think of things being difficult, they were always better than what the future held, which always got worse. When they no longer wanted us in the glass factory, we were transported on those cattle cars, and we must have been taken from Poland into Germany. When we crossed the border, after 3 days and 3 nights of being on the trains without food, without water, without any sanitary conditions, no bathroom facilities whatsoever, but that's true of anybody who was in those transports. The doors were open, the dead bodies were thrown out, and the rest of us had to jump down. And there was a big announcement saying the men would go to one side and the women to the other. And my father realized when you'd go into a camp, you'd have to get undressed to take showers for disinfection or whatever reasons. And he realized that they would shoot me on the spot when they found out that I'm not one of the men. So he met a school teacher and he asked her if she would keep an eye on me, and we would meet after the war. I never saw my father again after that. I don't know if he perished in Buchenwald, where most of the men went, or in a death march, or any place else. But after the war, my adopted parents tried to look for any family, and there was nobody left. Anyway, I was taken to Bergen-Belsen with this woman, who turned out to be one of my new mothers. I don't even remember her name. And we were taken into these showers. They really were cold water showers. And we did have to leave all our things there, including some pictures that my father had given me. And to the soldier, they were garbage. To me, it would have been the difference to know whether my children looked like anybody, whether I looked like anybody, my grandchildren. Nothing was left of that. This woman really risked her life to save. She stole a black coat that somebody else must have had to leave, and that coat protected us from the cold, because we were always very, very cold, lying on the stone floor with straw. And she did many things to help me. I don't know what happened to her. But when she disappeared, somebody else came along. As a child, I always had somebody. They wanted to belong to somebody, and I needed to belong to somebody, so that always worked out in my favor. The conditions in Bergen-Belsen, of course, were just terrible. There was very little food, and there were no change of clothes. There were no bathrooms. We had to go out in the fields, and everybody was very sick with typhus and typhoid, including myself. And one day I was lying. I didn't work. Children, I guess they were hoping for a trade or something, and people were just dying because there was so much infectious diseases and lack of food and drink and no medicines. And one day, people who had always walked around like zombies and not making any noises, they started running and they started talking, and I had no idea what was happening. But what happened was that the British came and liberated the camp. And when they liberated the camp, they burned down all the barracks because the disease and the smell and the stench was so strong. But they made like a tent city. And because I was one of the lucky ones, I was taken into like a tent hospital and given food and medication and brought back to health. And again, because I was one of the very lucky ones, there were 6,000 people who went to Sweden, and I was amongst those. And I was placed into a displaced persons camp in Sweden, where I was adopted or taken in by another mother, whom I don't know what happened to her. And then I was very sick, so I was placed into a hospital. A Swedish Christian man came to visit me every day, and brought me a doll and brought me food and was very good to me. And he wanted to adopt me, and I would have more than gladly gone with him. But the people around me said that I was Jewish. I had no idea what that meant. There was really very little memory in those 6 years. And they said I belonged in Palestine or in Eretz Israel with the other orphans. While I was waiting to go with the other children, there was a woman who had a son and daughter. Her brother had escaped to the United States before the war, and he sent a passport for those 3 people and visas and all the necessary papers. The little girl was 9 years old, and her name was Fanny. While they were waiting for the ship, she died. Her mother had a passport and all the proper papers, and she asked me if I wanted to be her daughter. So my picture was put into that passport, and I really became that child and came to the United States. Shortly after we came here, this woman died. And the family who brought her really weren't ready to accept another mouth to feed, and really I was a child. They knew of a family in Brooklyn, New York, who were childless, and they invited me for a weekend, and that really started the rest of my life. I was adopted by them, given a new name. My name is Rina, which means joy. My Yiddish name was Fredel, Fredja in Polish, and it really means the same part of joy, it just gone through many different changes. Never talked about the Holocaust until 1981, when there was a gathering of Holocaust survivors. And I came to Israel hoping to find somebody or something. I went through all the computers, found nothing. And I realized that if nobody puts anything in the computers, I'm not going to find anything. So I went on a search, and I wrote to the International Tracing Bureau in Arleston, and I found something that happened or didn't happen. They knew something about my mother and brothers and something about me. They didn't know anything about my father. Then I found my name on a list in Sweden, a list in Bergen-Belsen, and I found a card in Yad Vashem which says, "Case closed, child adopted in America." And then I went back to Poland, where I found my birth certificate and my brother's birth certificates and my parents' marriage license and the apartment where we lived with the mezuzah still on the door, and the Polish woman who lives there remembered my family. And slowly I've been getting more and more information. That's in short period.
Firstly, when you were going through the camps and the ghetto and with your father and your mother first and your father and later with other women, how did you understand what was happening to you? Did someone explain?
I don't remember anybody explaining, and I just knew. I think that you learn just intuition that everything that was happening was just happening. And it got to be very normal. I mean, you realized that you couldn't cry if you were hungry, and you couldn't cry if you got hurt or if you're scared, because everybody was in the same position. And maybe as a child it was easier to accept it than people who knew the difference what it was like before. I mean, when I saw dead bodies, now if I would see something like that, I think I'd run and cry and feel that most awful kind of thing. But that was a normal process because it was just there.
Do you recall your father explaining to you what was happening?
No. I don't think anybody explained. I think he just took it. I don't know that anybody couldn't explain anything like that. It was just such a different world, different planet. There was nothing that was the way it was supposed to be. I mean, children weren't supposed to be hungry or killed or thrown into bonfires or working full time. Could my father say to me, "I wish you didn't have to work"? He had no choice of that. No.
And what prompted your search for Kangisser, or what prompted you to start speaking more about the Sharon?
Well, I hadn't, because it was something that nobody wanted to talk about. Everybody was always afraid that they're going to hurt my feelings. I didn't want to bring it up. I didn't want anybody to know I was adopted. I was very much ashamed of that. I didn't want anybody to know that I had been sick. I wanted people to be my friends, and if I was sick, maybe they wouldn't play with me or talk to me. And then as I grew up, it just didn't come up. I think everybody was very careful not to mention it. When I was going to school, when I first came to the United States, I went to a private school, a Jewish school, and the class went to see a movie called My Father's House. And the teachers and the principal and my parents agreed that I should not go to see anything about that. Instead, I was taken to see Pinocchio. So people were trying to shelter me, I guess, shield me from these different things. In 1981, I just decided it was time to stop putting my head into the ground like an ostrich. And the gathering was there. It was the first big gathering that they had. And I came with my children. And we started looking. And once I realized that there's a possibility of finding things, we just went on. Then in 1984, when we made Aliyah, both my husband and I decided to volunteer for different things. And I decided to volunteer in Yad Vashem. So what I do in Yad Vashem is give tours to tourists or just school groups, and to give testimony. And at first it was very, very difficult. Then it gets easier as you talk about it.
Why was it difficult?
It was difficult because every time you'd get to a certain subject, you would just sort of start crying and have to catch your breath and say, you know what, you've got to go on regardless. It never gets completely easy. I mean, the story doesn't change, but you sort of, learn to accept it anymore. I also think that if we were spared, there was a reason for us to live. And I'm not quite sure exactly what the reason, whether I was meant to live so that I would marry the man I did and have his children or grandchildren. And maybe I wasn't that important, though they were, but we were needed as a link. But I also feel it was with a privilege came a responsibility, and there's so many people who deny the Holocaust now that I think it's important for a person to say, I was there, I saw it, it's not just a history. And as long as I'm in that position, I'd like to do it.
Were there any events in history of Israel and America that made you reflect on the Shoah in a different way, or made you think about it? Aspect that you hadn't thought about before, what was going on in the world, in the Jewish world?
In the Jewish world, well, when my adopted father died, I was very close to him. And in the Jewish religion, in the Orthodox, I imagine probably all segments, the children, the wife or husband, parents have something called kriya, which is rendering the garments. At my father's funeral, this rabbi, it was a very, very traumatic experience for me, did the rendering of the garment for my mother and for my aunt and uncle, who were the brother and sister of my father. And he was finished, and somebody said, you forgot Rina. And they said, well, she wasn't really his daughter, which sort of, whether you were thinking about it or not, that was not the time to think about it or bring it up, and many people in that audience probably didn't even know. It wasn't something that went around. So whether you want to think about things, the Holocaust or not, they're there, and they come out. And the same thing happened 2 days ago. I went to the doctor for a checkup. When you go to a doctor for the first time, he asks you your medical history. Anybody have diabetes? Does anybody die of a heart attack? High blood pressure? And my answer is, I don't know. And they sort of look at you as if, I'll explain it to you, what it means. I said, you don't have to explain it. I know what you're saying, what you're asking. I just don't have the answers, and I never will. I don't know if that's historically what you're looking for.
No, things that bring it up for you, or things that make you reflect on it.
During the Gulf War, was very, very much brought up because everybody in the country was very much afraid. We had no idea what was going to happen with the Scuds. And some of my children brought their children, my grandchildren, here while they went out to work when things got to be where you could go out to work, but the sirens would go off at night, and we stayed together. And I felt that maybe we should get passports for the babies. They were all babies. You can see them lying here like that. So we do a lot of babysitting, and maybe there's a chance of running away, which would make a lot of sense. Nobody in my family thought the way I did. I mean, my daughters, I have 3 daughters living here, they said their husbands would have to go into the Air Force or into the Army. They would be needed to help them. So I said, okay, if you have to stay, why are the children staying? Why does a 3-month-old or a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old have to be here? But nobody else thought of running away. The only one who felt there was a need for it. I also bought more food than the stores had to keep supplied, and listened to the radio. I also felt how lucky we were to have a state of Israel, and the gas masks, and that I was a grandmother who was keeping her children away from the gas, where the other grandmothers in the Shoah, they were given their children, and they were usually the first ones to be taken. So because we have a state of Israel, and because we are where we are today, we're in a much better situation.
Did you feel a difference in being a survivor in the States opposed to Israel?
Only because I got so involved, and I talk about the Holocaust now, whereas in the States I really never did. And many of the people, I speak English like an American because I never knew any other language because I was a child and I went to school there. So many people didn't know, and it's not the first thing that comes up. It's just here that I've sort of gotten a reputation, like you called me because you knew. In the States you wouldn't have known, so you wouldn't have called me. So I'm very much more involved with it here. Maybe, with the Holocaust museums coming up in the States, had I gotten involved there, maybe. But this is a closer community, so people sort of learn from one another. I'm also much more interested in it.
Why do you think?
Why am I more interested? First of all, I'm always searching, and I'm helping other people to search. And there are places to find, and more things are available, both in Yad Vashem and in the various tracing bureaus, even the American Red Cross. And I guess I'm not as afraid of touching it. A few years ago, an aunt of mine asked me whether I'm in touch with the people who hid me, the Christians who hid me. And I said, Aunt Ruthie, I was never hidden by Christians. And she said, well, all children who were saved. And she just never asked me, and I never told her. It was just something we didn't discuss. Here, people do talk about it.
Why do you think you're more able to touch it now?
I'm more surrounded with it, and I'm more interested in it. And I'm just not as afraid. I think my grandchildren are also more interested in my children. Well, I never really talked about it with my children. Whatever they knew, they sort of picked out, whereas my grandchildren are learning it in school. My older ones have been to Yad Vashem, and they've interviewed me. For school, for Yom HaShoah, every child has to go and ask somebody who's a survivor, so they sort of know, whereas my children didn't have to do that.
Did you feel that you wanted to tell your children?
No, not at all. And I don't know which comes first. Is it that the children would ask or that you would tell? Now, I've gone to second generation conferences where I've heard of children who say, my parents talk about it all the time, and sick and tired about it. And then you have other people saying, you're lucky because my parents never talk about it, and I have no idea who my relatives were. So I guess it's the situation you're placed in, it's the environment you're placed in. But my grandchildren seem to be much more interested. I think by now, I've also been asked to speak to people, so they've come to hear me, and by now it's a very open thing.
Any particular person that represents your experience, or you identify as being someone who represents your story or the story of the Shoah, writer or another survivor, or...
Well, there are many books that you read in that you identify with. Elie Wiesel's Night, the way he describes students, Primo Levi. There are many. We're having a speaker, Olivia Jackson, who wrote a book, Ellie, as a child. Most of these people were older than I. You read many of the children. As I said, most of the the autobiographies that I've read about children were children who were in hiding. And there are very few children, really, who were in the camps. I mean, the children were the first ones to be killed or who died. But there are an awful lot of good books. The book The Survivor by Terence DeFray discusses feelings that you can put yourself into. Lots and lots of books like that.
What about Elie Wiesel? In his book Night, you started to...
Well, he discusses how he felt about on the train, how he felt about the cold, how he saw his father. And it's just a very moving, very difficult kind of thing to see. But any book on the Holocaust, you read it knowing that it's happening to other people, but you also put yourself into it. Or in Schindler's List, which is the movie, you watch it. And I don't know if you remember that there was a little girl in a red coat. And then there were piles of clothes, and there was the red coat. The movie was in black and white. I didn't know if anybody else saw that red coat. It made such a huge impression on me, the clothing. And then I spoke to other people did see it also. So I guess you brought out the things that...
Why the red coat? Why did it speak to you? So...
Because it was a child's coat. children's shoes.
Are there any things that you don't identify with that you feel strongly against in terms of representation?
There are many people who claim that that everybody was out for themselves. Even in Ali Rizal's book, how people stole bread from each other and how they stole shoes and how people trampled over each other and things like that. And I know it happened. I mean, I don't fool myself at that. But on a personal basis, or I heard a survivor talking about how terrible the Swedes were, or how terrible this one was, I just keep on thinking of myself that I would not have been saved had people not gone out of their way to help me. As a child, I could not possibly have done it alone. I wasn't so smart, I wasn't so wise, I wasn't so strong. So when I hear about other people not helping each other, I accept it, but I don't identify with it.
When did you go back to theatrical?
First time I went back was in 1989. There was a trip that Yad Vashem was giving to their staff, and as volunteers we were allowed to go. We paid our own way and took our own food because the trip was paid and it was not kosher, and most people didn't care, we did. And it was the first time. It was very frightening, but it turned out to be a very moving experience because, as I said, I went to the town hall, and I don't know what would have happened had I not found my birth certificate. Would it have proved that I wasn't born? You know, I doubt that, but the fact that you have proof that what you're saying, many of the things that I used to think about by myself and not discuss it, I sometimes doubted myself. Not that anybody said so, but I kept on thinking, how do I prove this? Going back to Petrograd and finding the glass factory where I worked, and finding the apartment and the woman who remembered my father, and seeing the kiosk across the street from a balcony, and somehow or other that stood out in my mind, was very revealing for me. And then I've been back several times because I was asked to go with the March of the Living as a survivor. And then you're sort of not looking for yourself, but you're looking to tell students about what happened and their questions. And some of the things were very moving. The first time I went, we went to Treblinka, and Treblinka has 17,000 volcanic stones that the Polish government made to look like tombstones, and sort of like a memorial. And some of the stones have names, and one of the stones has the name of Petrograd. I couldn't find it. You know, it's huge, and didn't know just where to look. When I came back, I had spoken to Rabbi Lau, whose father was the rabbi in our hometown. He's the chief rabbi here, and his brother Naftali Levi, and they told me approximately where it was. When I went back with the March of the Living, and every bus that I spoke to, I said, you know what, I'd like everybody to help me. If anybody sees the stone of Petrograd, I would so appreciate it if you would tell me. And I spoke to one bus of teenagers who I wasn't sure that they were really so in tune in what they were going. These are teenagers who almost stereotype when I talk about it because they were good kids, but earrings in their nose and earrings in their ears and earrings on their eyebrows and, you know, laughing and going on. And I talked to them and I said, I wonder whether anything is penetrating. And when we got into Treblinka, one of those boys that I've just described to you started running over to me and he said, Rina, I found it. I found it. I prayed that I would find it. I found the stone, and he pulled me over and he says, I wanted so much to find it because he came from South America. Half of his family was Jewish, half was not. He didn't know any Holocaust survivors. There was no religion in his life. He wanted to be part of the Jewish people. He felt now that he found my stone, he belonged to this. So you never know what kind of impression you're going to make. I mean, he was the most unlikely kid, and it made a tremendous impression on him and certainly on me.
What do you think about March of the Living?
I think it's a very important thing. I mean, right now there's talk about going to Poland or not. When I've gone with the groups, I found that it's a wonderful way of teaching about the Holocaust, but even more importantly, it's a way of showing that all Jews, whether they were religious or not, were in the same category, and also to show how very important the state of Israel was. If we had a state of Israel to run to at that time, how many people could have possibly been saved? And I think that anybody who goes to Poland and comes to Israel thinks about it. It's made a tremendous impression.
For example, those students on that bus who, I mean, you had a very great experience in terms of him.
Well, you see, I didn't know what to expect, and apparently it made a huge difference. And what they were thinking and what they looked like was very different. You know, when you see kids with bandanas and long hair and you know, chewing around and listening to loud music, you wonder, are they really going to be interested in this? Apparently they were. I guess the fact that they even, I don't know if they were sent there or came there, but it made a tremendous difference. I don't know of anybody who went who didn't come back very, very moved. It's not an easy trip to take, and anybody who's a sensitive person really has to be prepared well for it.
Did it bring up stuff for you that you hadn't thought about going back?
Oh, sure. You know, when you go into the barracks and you see the stone floor and you just can't help picturing the straw and the lice eating away there, and certain smells come back. You know, you go into a bathroom with a urinal and everybody smelled like that, and the coldness. You walk through Auschwitz and that coldness, that wind that's going through, it just goes through your bones and you feel it. And you just can't believe that that this possibly could have happened to you or to anybody else. In 1981, when I came here, I had some very funny experiences that I couldn't believe, and I thought they were so wonderful. We were at Binyanei Ha'uma, which was near the Hilton Hotel at the time. And the bathrooms, of course, you always have to wait online. So some of us went to the Hilton to use the bathroom there. And there was a line on the ladies' room. And as I was waiting, a well-dressed woman came out and she said, "Oh, those bathrooms are so dirty." And I said, "You know what? We have bathrooms at the Hilton, and a lot of people were using them, so maybe some paper fell on the floor." I mean, this woman probably didn't have a bathroom for years and used the field, and she's able to think about it. And then I went to the plaza, and there was a woman with a number on her arm who was trying on a dress, and she wasn't sure if the red one was good or the blue one was good. Isn't it wonderful that we can choose and we can not choose, and you forget about the past, and you want to be a normal person. And I mean, in those days, if anybody gave you a garbage bag to put on, you would feel that you were lucky. So it's you know, it's just the kind of thing that you think about. It made me laugh, but it's wonderful that people do forget.
How do you think they manage themselves? I mean,
it's very easy. You know, it's very easy when, well, it's not easy. I mean, you know, you go to a wedding, and many survivors will tell you that I'm having this wedding and I can't help thinking that none of my family is here and how everybody would have enjoyed this and so on and so forth. But, you know, you don't forget that way. But if you look at most survivors, they have made successful lives and they have started families. People wanted to start families very quickly. They wanted to belong to somebody, so that you very often had marriages that wasn't just for love. It was for comfort. Or you'd have an educated man marrying a very simple woman, or a very educated woman marrying an old man. They just wanted to belong. But once you make a life of yourself, you do. I mean, you know, most survivors, I once had a group of survivors here, and if you look at my house, it's green and white, and quite light and colorful. And this group came, and they didn't know. This was a group of Christian students, and they wanted to meet an Israeli, and they did not know that I was a Holocaust survivor. I invited them to the house. We do a lot of home hospitality, and we got to talking about the Holocaust, and I said, "Well, what do you think a Holocaust survivor looks like?" And they gave me their descriptions, and what do you think their house would be like? And they said, "It's probably gray and dark and gloomy." And I said, "Well, would you believe that my home, which is exactly the opposite of that?" And they found it hard to believe. And then I told my daughter, because I thought it was a funny experience, and she says, I never realized why you like green so much, but maybe it's because it is life and light. Now, I don't know if it's true. Maybe I just like the color just as I like blue and red also, but you can look into and read into everything, I suppose.
So you say it's quite, it has been an easy thing in terms of splitting off that.
Oh, yes. I'm not that child in everyday life, no. I've had, the first 10 years of my life was a totally different life than most children have. But after that, it was a very normal American teenager, and then I got married and had children. And no, I don't think about it all the time.
Is your husband?
My husband is not a survivor, and he was never really interested until we came to Israel, and it's very much part of our lives. But in the States, we never really talked about it very much. He always knew.
Did you want to talk about it more?
No. No, there was no purpose in it. Also, I think as I was growing up, you didn't have the Yom HaShoah commemorations that you do now. I think most people in the world now. In the States, there was no siren. I read every day in the paper now there's about the Holocaust. You ask me what it pertains to me, the claims conference and the slave labor and compensations, things like that. I have no interest in it. And thankfully we don't really need it in monetary terms the way some survivors do. And I wouldn't even know how. If I would have to go to see if there's records of when I was working in a slave labor camp, I don't even know what name I used. I was a boy at the time with a different name. That doesn't really interest me, but I think it's important that other people do it.
Why?
Why shouldn't they get paid for what they deserve, and why shouldn't they have some compensation for their losses? I don't even know that the house that I lived in belonged to my parents. They were very young. I was 26 when I was born. But if it didn't belong to them, maybe it belonged to their parents. I have no way of proving it, but people who can certainly should get what's rightfully theirs. It was taken away from them. And anybody who worked as a slave laborer or who lost their education or who lost everything that they owned, and the artworks and the gold or the life insurance policies, I don't know where the question why is. Why not?
Sometimes going back.
Well, why not? If you've been hurt in an accident, sometimes that case takes a long time, but you're entitled to what's rightfully yours.
How do you think you make sense of your experience in terms of if you found an explanation in terms of yourself?
No, if you're asking me whether I believe, for instance, which is a question that many people ask, do you believe in God or do you believe in religion? I believe very strongly in God. I want very much to be an Orthodox Jew, and I have brought up my children that way, and they want it that way also. I don't understand where God was. I don't understand how this could have happened. I don't think I could have been saved unless God meant for me to be saved, but I don't know why he chose me and not 1.5 million other children and adults, 6 million other people. I can't give any explanation there now. But I think it's very, very important for us to live the kind of life, very important for me to live the kind of life that I'm living as a Jewish observant people, because Hitler wanted to wipe out all the Jews by assimilating, by intermarrying. We were sort of helping him along on his cause. The other day I heard a very good lecture. Actually, it wasn't a lecture. I spoke to a group of Christians, and the person who introduced me, this was from the Bridges for Peace. I don't know if you heard of it. It's a Christian group that comes to Israel and believes very much in the Jews living in Israel. And the person who introduced me said, we're all responsible for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism started with the church and started with the Christianity, and the Jews were blamed for all kinds of things. And the church and the Christians could have done a great deal to prevent anti-Jewish riots. And he says we were very lucky because Hitler did the job for us. So, and he says, and now we have to make up for that. And I was introduced. So I sort of said, you know, it was such a perfect introduction to put it. He really said so much more than I would have dared say to a group of Christians. And I sort of said to them, you know, I'm so glad to see a group like this coming and be our friends. If we had people in the late 1930s and 40s, if the countries had opened their gates to us, if the state of Israel had been born, if there were more righteous amongst the nations tried to help us. But we didn't have so many friends. And to be perfectly honest, we don't have so many friends now. An awful lot of countries still hate Israel. But if we have people like these Christians coming to help us, at least we're grateful for them.
What do you feel about Germans?
Well, as a nation, I feel very strongly against them. I would never go to Germany, and we've traveled a great deal and have never gone there. But I have met Germans in Yad Vashem who come who wished it didn't happen. So I guess we sort of can blame some of the newer people who are coming here. I think the people who hate us, who despise us, who don't admit it happened, I don't meet them. They're not the ones who are coming here, and I'm not about to go there. I think someone like William Goldhagen, who wrote the book where he blames not only the Nazis or Gestapo, but all Germans, I think he's got a very good point there. Because I think that you don't have to be just the person who goes out killing. If you're a bystander who does nothing about it or protest against it, you're also to blame.
In the Poles?
And the Pope?
In the Poles?
The Poles. The same thing. There were many Poles who were perfectly happy to get rid of it. The woman who moved into our apartment, you know, claims that when the Jews moved out, she moved in. Now, for her, this was a great coup. I mean, they were able to get many of these different things. I have a different feeling than some of the people that I went with on the March of the Living or other times, because they all look at the Poles, hating them and feeling that the Poles would like to kill us now and take everything that we have. And they're probably right. On the other hand, I found it amazing, I guess it's my personality that I look at the positive of it, that Israeli security guards hired Polish people to act as security guards also. And there were these Poles with guns protecting Jewish children. And that was their job, whether they wanted to or not, whether they had a different kind of feeling. But this was it, and I think it's just very ironic, to see how things have changed. I also have no desire to go to Poland or to get my property back. I mean, I'd like to get it back just as a vengeance or because the right thing, but I certainly wouldn't want to live in Poland. It's not something, if I'd have an apartment there, I'd go for vacation. Absolutely not.
How did you respond when you heard this kind of idea coming through much of anything about the Poles, about that kind of...
They're probably true. I think many of the Poles probably do hate the people, and I think the story with the crosses at Auschwitz right now, where they think that the Jews were part of the Poles. But during the Holocaust, they weren't. There was very much difference between being a Polish Pole or a Polish Jew. And there still is a difference in every country, probably.
Do you think there's been an abuse of the Holocaust in terms of politics or in terms of...
Maybe some people have tried to make money of it somehow, but I think all the museums and all the books and the movies that are coming up are, I would say, more positive than negative. And if people are making money by it, someone like Steven Spielberg, Kol HaKavod, because the more you show people, the more you teach people, the more they're aware of it. So I think every museum that goes up, every book that comes out, every movie is beneficial.
Despite what it's about? I mean, in terms of...
I really haven't seen anything that I thought So, oh, yeah, there was once an exhibit in the Israel Museum, an art exhibit showing Hitler and his sex life. Did you see that? Oh, it was awful. I went because people were talking about it, and I figured I have to see what they're talking about it. I know a lot of people objected to the book Mouse because it was done in cartoons. There's a movie which I haven't seen called Life is Beautiful. Have you seen it? Yeah, it's supposed to be in Hebrew in Italian with Hebrew subtitles. I don't know how much I'll understand, but I want to see it because I want to know what people are talking about. And people sort of felt, how do you just joke around about the Holocaust? But if it teaches people, there was a very good movie that I saw not long ago about Jacob the Liar, where this man was arrested because he was out past curfew. And while he was in that trial in the court, he overheard that the Russians were coming closer. And when he was allowed out, he told everybody he knows that the Russians are coming closer. And the more he told, the more into a lie he got. But people started believing him and having hope and wanting to live rather than committing suicide or running away. And the more he got himself embroiled, the more he said so. And of course, at the end, the Russians were not coming so close. Was he wrong in lying? I mean, it was what the movie was about. It gives you an awful lot to think about. If somebody could get hope from something like that, maybe what he did was absolutely right. And this man in this Life is Beautiful is trying to show his child, apparently, of how to keep alive through humor. It wasn't that he was making a joke of the Holocaust. I think I also object to people, every time that there's a fight or there's a massacre or there's an incident, everybody says, oh, these people are Nazis and it's a Holocaust. I think the Holocaust was unique. I don't think any place in the world, any war in the world, ever came to it. Because most wars, people fight to obtain property and territory, or they want you to do what they want you to do. In Nazi Germany, if you said, take all my property, I'll go away, I'll do whatever you want. Toward the end of the war, Hitler and his henchmen wanted to get rid of every Jew. And if a Jew would say, I'll become a good Catholic, and you could take my property and things like that, wouldn't have helped. Every Jew, every child, every baby was going to be annihilated, according to the Nazi.
They don't understand, it just points at different events or things. I should want to ask you, how did you feel being a survivor all your life? Did you feel anything about it?
I just felt very lucky to be alive, but it's not something that I go around. I'm not a survivor. I'm a wife. I'm a mother. I'm a Jewish woman. I'm a guide. I'm a hostess. I'm a friend. Why give yourself just the name of a survivor? That's not a single category. In Israel, I'm an American. Or I'm a student, or I'm a teacher. I mean, there's so many different categories that's just one thing that you are. If I'm blonde, or if I'm fat, or if I'm tall or short. I mean, I don't think that you can just put one label on a person. You're many things.
Very nice way of thinking. That's very...
But you are. Not only that, but you're a different person depending on the situation. If I would meet you in college and we'd be the same students, even though they're different ages, that's who we are at the time. If we're protesting against something, that's where we are. We're never the same person. I mean, yesterday I had a big party in my house and somebody came in and she says, you're Naomi's mother. That's who I was yesterday. I was supposed to be a friend of the Chatan and Kala who made the party, but I wasn't. I was or the grandmother of somebody, or a guide. You were my guide last year. Or remember when I stayed in your house? You were my hostess that way. Many names.
How would you like the Holocaust to be remembered?
as a terribly tragic, probably the most tragic part of the Jewish people, and a terrible event in all humanity. I mean, the Jews were the victims. The Jews were people chosen by God. But the Nazis were also created by God. And how could one human being do that to other human beings? How could one group of people do that to others? And it's something that could never happen, but unfortunately it is happening in different places all over.
People with a different planet?
Of course, it's just not believable. It's not believable when you read books, or when you remember things of how a soldier could take a baby and throw him into a bonfire, or send them knowing into a crematorium, and then coming home and seeing his little girl and having a birthday party. How could the same human being do that? How could you be so completely, have such a split personality? It must have been a different planet. You can't be a human being and shoot a whole row of people and then come home and play with your wife and children.
Did you feel you were in a different planet?
I never knew differently. I don't know what I felt like at the time. It was just something that was happening every day. And there was always hope that tomorrow would be better. It had to be better. It couldn't get worse. So every time you thought it was as worse as could be, something worse happened.
And when you got to the States, the difference?
I accepted that. I mean, I thought it was just wonderful. I mean, I came to the States, I was sort of like a mascot because there weren't too many refugee children. And I was sent into a school and the children said, say plate, and I said plate. And say table, and I said table, girl, girl. And I believed that every day a new word would be born. Today the name plate was born because everybody seemed to know what this was. Now, I never knew that. And when I got a dress, I accepted, that, and when I got food, I accepted that. And when I think of things that I like or I don't like, how could you not like something? I mean, had anything like that been given to me at that time, it would have been ambrosia, the most marvelous, marvelous thing. So it's the human mind that lets you forget and just accept. It was marvelous.
Anything else that you would like to say?
No, you seem to have a lot of questions there that you haven't asked me.
I've done that.
I've been doing a lot of talking.
No, that's what you meant to do. How do you feel about the Spielberg Foundation?
I think it's very good. I think that what he's doing is wonderful. First of all, the film itself has taught so many people about the Holocaust, even though it has a happy Hollywood ending and it's done maybe differently than. But I think people would go to see that, but they won't go to see documentaries. I also think giving this money for the heritage, for the Spielberg Foundation, I took the course to interview people, and there are people who were willing to talk, and there are people who don't, and he got people to talk, if not for groups, at least for themselves, so that those would be left for their children and grandchildren.
So you interviewed people?
I never did it, no. I just found that it just took too much time. I took the course, and that was very interesting just to find out what kind of questions would be asked, and how to go about it. I know a lot of survivors. I know quite a few people who I was interviewed by Spielberg. I don't know if it was, it depends who interviews you, and it depends the day that you're being interviewed. I've had some very good interviews, and I've been written up in different places. I remember the first time a great interviewer asked me something that was really took me by surprise. She asked me if I remembered losing my baby teeth. Now, that's not something that you think about with the Holocaust, but she wanted to know how far my memory goes. I don't remember losing my baby teeth, and yet I have adult teeth. But it was something that was happening at that time, and it apparently didn't make much effect, and the tooth fairy didn't come to me or anything of that sort. She asked things of that sort which were not the typical questions that you have interviewers ask you. I've also had interviews that have been absolutely impossible. There was a lovely woman who interviewed me in Hebrew, and I don't know whether she didn't understand me or I couldn't have possibly given her those answers. And when I read about them, I was so embarrassed because she wrote, as a child of 3, I ran away from Treblinka. There was no way any child of 3 could possibly. First of all, at 3, there was still a ghetto. Treblinka wasn't even around. Second of all, no child ever ran away from Treblinka, any child who ever got there. So if you start reading that interview before anything else, you say, this woman is an absolute liar or making up or whatever it is. And then we have this nice apartment, and we like to do a lot of tzedakah, so we have had weddings here. I told you last night we had Sheva Brachot for 44 people, and we've had bar mitzvah. We've had all kinds of things. And many of like we've had 2 weddings of second marriages where both of those couples were able to afford to go to a hotel or to a private something like that. We offered it because we had something to do with the meeting, and we thought also it was more private, and this way they had a perfectly good excuse of inviting their immediate families and saying, listen, it's a private home, I can't invite hundreds of people. And then she wrote, about how we were so good because we make weddings for poor people. Now, it's not very flattering to those people to think that they're these poor, unfortunate people. That's not why we made the wedding. So sometimes you're interviewed, and it's not what you mean. Saying didn't come across that way.
Do you like being taken back to?
Taken back to? No, I can't say I like it, but it's much easier now than it was. I mean, I don't well up with tears the way I used to, or think about it. It's also taken me a long time to figure things out that I couldn't. There were many things that happened that I just didn't understand, and I never discussed it with anybody as a child or as a teenager. When I came to the United States, and when this woman, Anna, who brought me as her daughter from Sweden, when she died, nobody explained to me that she died and we were going to bury her. I was just taken to the cemetery. Everybody was crying. There was a hole in the ground. And usually you're so careful about telling a young child what it was, but they just assumed that I must have known about this, and I had seen so many hundreds of thousands of dead bodies. Well, I had, but I had never seen anybody cry over one person being lowered in a casket. And I didn't know for a long time what it was, and until I figured it out. One of the other things that I didn't figure out is we were on Death March going to Bergen-Belsen, and there were 2 men lying in the snow with their pants down. And I couldn't figure out why people would be lying in the snow. Did they have to go to the bathroom? Did they there? Afterwards, after reading, I realized that if a Jewish woman ran away, she had much better chance than a Jewish man who, if they found out he was circumcised, would be a dead giveaway that he was there. And these men were lying there to show us you're not going to get away with it. But it took me years to figure it out. And many other incidents like that I just didn't understand. One of them was I found a cousin. Thank you. I found a cousin, an uncle, and his son who was the cousin. And this uncle was an uncle by marriage. His wife was my biological mother's sister. And when I met him, and my name was Fredja when he remembered me. Oh, Fredja, you're so cute, and you look just like your 2 sisters. And I said, I didn't have sisters. I had brothers. And he said, oh, how could you remember? You were such a little girl. You had these lovely, cute sisters. I went home absolutely devastated because I kept on trying to remember these sisters. And I remembered my 2 brothers. I remembered their name was David and Yossi, David and Joseph. And I couldn't picture them. And I kept on saying, he must know better because he was older, he was wiser, he was smarter. When I went to Poland and I found my brother's birth certificates, I realized that I didn't have to doubt myself. But these are the kinds of things that make very, very difficult because you try so hard to remember. I don't remember what anybody looked like. I have no idea what my mother or father or brothers looked like. No pictures of grandparents or aunts and uncles. My adopted mother, who's my mother, I'm just saying that to you, did these paintings on my walls, and this little girl is my granddaughter, Shani. And everybody who comes in asks if that's me when I was a little girl. So I guess she looks like me, but I look like anybody else. So.
How many grandchildren?
We have Kanina her 20.
Wow.
No,
That's amazing.
That's our youngest on the floor.
Absolutely amazing.
We started out on that green couch. We just had a few of them, and then each year we sort of add. And they're really good kids.
When you were young, did you think that your parents were going to come back? I mean, did you ever that they were gone?
I don't remember thinking about it. But, that's not true. To this day, sometimes I meet a man, or I see somebody walking the street who looks familiar, and I say, could that be one of my brothers? Just the way I survived, which was impossible. Could one of them have survived and I wouldn't know it, or he wouldn't know it? Or would my father be alive, or something like that? I think I sort of knew that my mother and brothers weren't, but maybe they are. And you always sort of feel maybe there would be a chance. But it's not something that you live with. Every once in a while you just think about it and say, maybe he is related somehow. But I've gone to gatherings of Pietrikov people, and nobody knows anything about them as if they never existed, and I never existed. And every time I go, I say, I'm not going to go again, because it's so difficult to come back. Let me get you some water. Stop it for a while. It has, and then very often my hands are sort of crooked, and a lot of people have it. But you always wonder, is it because of the malnutrition, or somebody says, were your fingers broken? I have no recollection of that, but they look like they may have been. So you've got this kind of feeling that there's sort of like there was an amnesia, where you remember, and there are certain things that you just can't remember, and there's no one there to help you out. And so when you asked me before about reading books, every time you read into books, you sort of feel, maybe I'll read something that will trigger. Actually, I found my name in 1981 when I started looking. I went to a place in Evo in New York, and I had gone to many other places, and every time I said that I was looking for myself, and I was giving them different things, people sort of said, it's impossible that a child of that age would have survived. So I stopped saying who I'm looking for. I was just doing research instead of telling them specifically. And I went to Evo. I asked to look for Bergen-Belsen. There was a list. And my last name was Lichtenstein, Fredja Lichtenstein. And this woman was absolutely sure that I would not find a child of that age who had been liberated from Bergen-Belsen and who had been in a slave labor camp. And I said, you know what, she's probably right, but let me look. And I decided to look through, and I found all the L's. And I was looking for L-I-C, and I couldn't find it. And I said, you know what, instead of giving up, let me keep on looking at all the names. And maybe my name was different at the time. Every time somebody took me, they gave me a different name. So maybe a name will jump out if I read every name there. And after the L-I's, there was the L-O's, and there was the L-U's, and then there was an L-I again. Apparently they had, it wasn't advertised well. And I found my name. And I got all excited, and I told her to the librarian, and she got all excited about it, but it's not something that you could believe. Once I found it, and I found the same thing in the Imperial War Museum. So many other places that you find things, and it is hard to believe.
What?
It's just so unnatural, so unreal. Look at it's like a soap opera, you know, and you sort of people make up a story like this. You can write a novel like this, but there's so many things that are happening that don't happen in everyday life.
Hard to see your name on the list.
I don't know if it was hard. I think it was very exhilarating to prove that I'm really here. So you say why? I know I'm here. But you have to prove it to yourself. Because it just doesn't sound... Look, if I have even a 10-year-old going into town now, you say, put on your coat and button your coat, and it's cold outside, and be careful of the cars, and don't speak to strangers, and because that's the natural thing to do. Child of 5 working, child of 5 being left alone, a child of 5 being transported. That's not really believable.
Can you say goodbye to your mom?
No. I don't know. I don't know how I managed to run away there. I don't remember. I can't imagine it would be a goodbye. It wasn't the kind of thing that you sort of felt. You ran and she would run after you,
or just a tell, or was it any like...
I don't remember.
Why did you make Aliyah?
We made Aliyah because we always felt that Israel was a wonderful place. We started coming here when our children were young. Our son was as little as a year and a half. And we used to come here all the time, and every time we came, we'd sort of said we'd like to find an apartment, and our children were very much part of B'nai Akiva, and they always said that they would come. And then one day, my mother had gone to a party across the street from here, and she heard that the man who built this house, his wife had died, and he was remarrying, and his new wife didn't want to live there. And she came to look at the apartment, and she said it was exactly what we were looking for. And my husband is very spontaneous kind of guy, and he bought it on the phone. And we came, and we loved it, and then we waited for our children to finish. Our daughter was going to Columbia, our son was still in high school. Our other daughter had married and come here, and everybody just wanted to, so we just came earlier than we had originally planned on, but it was the best thing we've ever done.
How was your first time in Israel?
Oh, the first time in Israel, I came here before I was married, in 1958. I came with a Mizrahi Hatzair group, but it was a sightseeing kind of group. But we were always very Zionistic, and it was a new country, and it was very exciting to be here. Then the first time I came with our family was in 1969, also as tourists. But, everything that you ever learned about the Bible, or about Israel, or about the kibbutzim, in the cities, and of course from 67 to now there's such a huge change in everything. We came in 84, and there's a big change from 84 till now too, but it's always getting better. We could have peace and not the fear of war. It would be a perfect place to be in.
You find it positive system?
Oh yes, very much so. I mean, I would never have had a chance to be a guide in Migdal David, which is the Museum of History of Jerusalem, and my husband is a volunteer where he is a Rosh Kola where he teaches, and we have 50, 60, or 70 people here every Thursday to a class. We meet a lot of interesting people. We do a lot of interesting things. It's a very, very full satisfying.
What do you feel like when you are with other people who went to the war survivors? Do you feel that...
I don't have very much... I've gone to a few child survivors conferences here in Israel, And I don't feel that they accept me very much because when they came as orphans to Palestine. They were put into kibbutzim. Life was very difficult. There was war going on. You didn't have the warmth, you didn't have the clothing, you didn't have the kind of food, you didn't have the psychological help. And if they were older, they had to go to work right away, so they never got their schooling. And they sort of feel that I'm this typical American who must have had a very easy time of things. And it's hard for them to believe that I was in the same position that they were at one point. And to some degree, I guess it was much easier because I came into a normal situation with, they grew up as orphans, many of them. And then the idea of Judaism and religion, if you were in a Christian home and you were brought up to go to church and to pray as a Christian, to all of a sudden being brought to Israel or being pulled away from nuns or something like that, and all of a sudden become Jewish again. It's a very, very difficult situation also. So I'm different from many of them. And when you get to talking and they find out that you were in the same position, they find it hard to believe it. If you hear stories about children who came to Palestine, and they would be questioned, let's say, for instance, if, whether to go to a religious kibbutz or not religious kibbutz, and they would be asked, do you remember your mother lighting candles? If I were asked that question, I wouldn't have the answer, and they didn't have an answer. Or do you remember your father going to a synagogue? You know, when the war is going on, these things aren't there, and they were put into a religious kibbutzim. So they were brought up in a completely different lifestyle than maybe they would have with other parents. I wasn't given any of those choices. I don't know what would have happened had I been adopted by a Christian man in Sweden. I'm sure I probably would have been a good Swedish Christian woman. It's not anything that you could possibly fathom.
Did you find it easy to talk to someone about the experience opposed to?
Yeah, I do. I find that that I seem to have some sort of a knack where people who don't want to talk, when I start talking to them, I have gotten a lot of people to open up, even without planning to. We have a very close friend who would never talk about any of his experience to his wife or his children or his grandchildren. And one day we were coming home. We had been out someplace, maybe at somebody's house for dinner, and we were in the car, and I just asked him a question, and he started talk, the way I'm talking to you now. And the more he talked, the more I asked him. We were down in the car for about an hour. When we came upstairs, my husband said, you really had no right doing that. You're opening up a Pandora's box, and he doesn't want to talk about it, and why did you get him to talk about it? And I hadn't realized what I had done, so I quickly ran to the phone, and I called him up, and I said, David, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to. And he said, no, and he started talking again, and for another hour, he talked on the telephone. And then after, he just wouldn't allow himself to stop, but once he started, and now he just went back to live up with his wife and 2 grandchildren. Now, I didn't mean to do this, and there was no purpose. I wasn't doing an interview like you are. And I've had other people like that also. We once had a group of people, 26 people here from England, and I was supposed to speak to them. And the rabbi's wife was an 8-year-old who took a 4-year-old sister over the Alps. And I said, and she never talked about her story. And I just said to her, how does a little girl manage to do this? And she started to talk. And for a half hour she talked. And
nice to meet you.
I wasn't planning. I just said, how do you? But after I had been talking and I was so open about it, she just let go, and then she started talking. I think sometimes it just has to hit the right nerve or something to get it going. And I find in Yad Vashem, but I find people talking when I once spoke in Hebrew Union College, and people hear different things. This boy who must have been about 16 or 17 from a Nifty program asked if he could speak to me after I had talked to the group. And he said to me, he never told anybody this, and all he heard in my whole talk was that I was adopted, and he was adopted. And he wanted to tell me how he felt and how I reacted. His whole thing, so different people hear different things. Or somebody else would sort of say, you know, I lost my mother in a car accident. And it's different maybe than losing her in the Holocaust, but it's still a loss of a mother. And how do you cope with it and how do you react to it? So people hear different things that you're saying, depending where you are.
So do you think it affected your mother?
I don't know. I wouldn't have been a different mother. That's who I am. I don't know.
Maybe it's your openness.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not asking you any questions now because I gather you came here. But actually, every time you ask me something, I would really like to have this a dual conversation. But you've come with a point.
No, by all means, you can ask me. Did you see Shoah?
Yes.
What did you think?
I thought it was a very good documentary if you have the patience to sit through 8 hours. I think I saw it in 2 stages. I thought the scene at the church where this man comes back and all the people talk about him, and or the scene on the boat where this boy sings for his soldiers was very moving, or the part in Treblinka where the guard claims he didn't know any of these different things. But I don't think it has the same kind of impact as some of the other movies like Steven Spielberg's, because it's the Hollywood version of it just makes it easier to accept. Not that many people would really have the time to sit through or to be willing to just listen to dialogue.
Except in terms of believe that it happened, or?
No, I don't know that anybody that I saw didn't believe that it happened. No, he had good footage there, and you could see people talking. It's just that it's dry in comparison to a story theme of various stories. There are many other documentaries that are very good also, but they're difficult to see and they're dry.
And when he calls those survivors to open up or they reach that very traumatic.
Well, some people can talk, and if you remember, like the barber who had such a hard time of it, I don't know if this was his first time or if it's not, you never know where you're going to break down. And sometimes it is a very sad point that you're pointing out, and sometimes it's a point of happiness where you can't believe that you were in that position. Or if something, has just happened. You really cannot plan ahead for it. His interviewing was very good.
What do you feel like when it happens?
And what happens?
When it comes to you, or you just feel...
Oh, you feel sad, and you feel you have to take a deep breath, and you just sort of say, if your eyes cloud up, you'll just say, excuse me, and I've learned not to be ashamed of it or anything like that. It's just there. I don't think there's anything really wrong with it. It's part of feeling, part of emotion.
Yad Vashem, do you think it's July, the museum,
Well, Yad Vashem has its own philosophy, which is different from other museums. If you go to the Museum of Washington, first of all, it's much more modern. I saw yesterday Yad Vashem got $8 million, so I'm sure they're going to modernize and expand. They are expanding right now. But they also talk about the American liberators in different points. In the museum in Los Angeles, you have the theme of stereotypes and tolerance. The museum in Lochamei HaGetoot up north in Israel, they show you what the shtetl was like, what the youth movements were like, and going into a full detailed account of the Warsaw Ghetto, because these are the survivors who had worked on this. Yad Vashem talks about the Jewish issue from 33 to 45. They don't talk about the homosexuals or euthanasia program. This is their aim, whether they're going to change it or not. But it's more than just a museum, it's also a memorial. You go into the Yiska Hall and people come on Asara B'Tevet. It's the day that people come to say Kaddish when they don't know in the Yurtzeit, the anniversary of the death of their parents. I don't know where the grave is and I don't know the anniversary. And in Israel there are many people in that position. So it's more than a museum. The others are more museums, and this is a shrine.
Which museum do you like or identify with the messages?
I would really like to go and study the Washington Museum, because when I go there, you'll go for a few hours and you probably need several days to really learn and to have all the pictures that they have, and then they have all the computers and they have the testimonies and the videos. I'm hoping Yad Vashem is going to be like that. They're building a new visitor center, and right now it's black and white pictures mostly. There are a few videos around. Going into the car, the cattle car, in Washington Museum. Apparently they discussed it with psychologists because there are two ways. Have you been there? Mm-hmm. So you can go through the car, or if you don't want to go through the car, you can go around it. So I guess they've taken the sensitivity of people. We have a car in Yad Vashem, and it's purely a display. So it's we also have an ambulance like that. If somebody doesn't explain it to you, it's a different kinds of things. The Washington Museum, you really don't need a guide through.
What do you feel about the car
in Yad Vashem?
In Washington. What do you feel about the...
I went through it. Because I felt that I should, that I had to. And then I felt very lucky to have gotten out of it. When I go to the Children's Memorial in Yad Vashem, when I take people, I tell them, both for their sake and for my own sake, that there is an exit, and we will be going out, even though we're going through that dark time, and hearing the names of the children who perished. So I guess it's for both of our sakes, theirs and ours. But I don't think that you can be afraid of it. I think you have to face things.
But we should face it, or people haven't been through it, or I wasn't quite sure in terms of who should be facing.
I think everybody should. I think if everybody is aware of what can happen, maybe we could prevent it.
To the point of walking through the cattle car, though? I mean, do you...
Well, the cattle car, I thought you were talking about the history. I don't think two people probably have the same reaction. Mm-hmm. Except, you know something? When you're there, you see what a small car that is. How'd you get 100 people in, 80 people in? How would you feel there without seats, without windows, without food, without a bathroom? In our lifestyle, if you take a long journey, you want to sit in a comfortable seat. Many trains that would take long journeys would have dining cars or people coming around selling Cokes and potato chips. And can you think of being in there, in the darkness, in the cold, with people who died in the same car, with people defecating and urinating and right next to you and the stench over there? I don't know if enough people would stay in that open car to even think about it. You just want to go through and get out and say, I've had the experience. So I don't know if other people have the same experiences. You know, like somebody who's been in a cast or who has a fear of claustrophobia is afraid to go into an elevator. And the rest of us go into an elevator and don't think twice about it. You always bring yourself along with you no matter where you go.
But do you feel that you want people to be able to come closer to that or not? To that understanding?
No, I think it's important to know about everything. I think very often you sort of say a doctor they should go through childbirth and through a kidney stone and things like that, because otherwise you don't understand somebody else's pain. Or what is the idea of walking somebody else's moccasins? I was once interviewed by Yad Vashem. It was not a very good interview. It was a very bad interview. The woman who interviewed me, every time I said, she would ask me a question. Like she would say, was the city bombed? So I said, I don't remember it being bombed, but by what I read. Or she would ask me about something, and I said, well, I don't, like you said to me, do I? And I said, I don't remember that, but I know. Like, I don't remember seeing my mother get on the train to go to Treblinka. I didn't do that. But I know that whole transport was taken, so I know that they must have gone by there. So she said, I don't want to hear anything that you learned afterwards. Like when I said I found my birth certificate, which is a very important thing to me. She doesn't want to know that. She wants to know where I was born. You know, she didn't want to find any of these different things. But she interviewed me. It was like a 7-hour interview because the person on the video all of a sudden had to go to follow some important people around in Yad Vashem, and then they came back. Anyway, a few months after the interview, she said that she brought parts of my interview to Germany. And I couldn't imagine what I had said that would be interesting to anybody in Germany. And she said this was a group of psychologists. And what they felt was important was to point out how a child could find things that were normal, abnormal, and abnormal, normal. And how they could just go on with the every kinds of things, whereas other people, you know, found it so difficult. And they used that particular, I can't remember what it was.
How did it make you feel?
I wish I could have heard what the psychologist said about me to see if I'm normal or not. Well, I guess everything that one can say can be taken apart. Or one doesn't say.
Did you ever want to go to a psychologist?
I wanted to go for hypnosis because there are so many things I don't remember. And as I said, now I have much more facts. I mean, I can show you a whole book of things that I have collected, including my names on all these lists, because I really didn't remember that I was in a camp called Bergen-Belsen. I knew I was in a camp. I still don't know when I came to Bergen-Belsen. I don't know how long I was there. I know when I left Bergen-Belsen because that's recorded. I know exactly the day of liberation because I wasn't the only one liberated. 1,350 people, 13,000 who were there were liberated at the same day, but people came in at different times. And I would like to see what my mother looks like, or you say, did I say goodbye to her? I don't remember any of that. Maybe through hypnosis I did. But people who I discussed it felt that I'm fairly normal, and why bring up things that I had no control over, good or bad? And hypnosis may bring up things that you'd rather not know about. Don't know what it is that I don't want to know about, but I also don't know if I want to take a chance with it. How do you feel about it?
Hard. Very hard. Because certainly they'll be locked, and that's for you, and it's okay on a certain level, but there's also certain things that...
I don't know.
What did you go to after you? I mean, you were liberated, but they burnt the...
I was liberated, and I told you they sort of made a makeshift hospital. And they didn't take the people whom they thought would die, because there wasn't enough room for everybody, and the people who were well didn't need it so much. So they took the people who were someplace in between. And I guess I was one of those. And I guess I was given food and medicine. And that was in April. In July, we were transported to Sweden. by ship and brought into a displaced persons camp. And I'll be glad to show you this booklet that I put together, where I wrote to Sweden, and they told me exactly when I came, what displaced persons I was brought to, which hospital I was transferred to, went to another displaced persons camp, and finally I left for the United States in 46. Well, I don't know what I consider myself in Sweden. You know, there were things that happened in Sweden that were different also. We were in a displaced persons camp, and we had outhouses, which means they're not toilets, they're really outhouses. I don't know if you've ever been one. They're wooden, like seats, and everything goes into the ground. And one day I was with some other children, and we had stolen apples from an apple orchard. I don't think we were hungry. I mean, maybe we were hoarding food, or maybe we just needed the food, or maybe we was, I don't remember why. But somebody started running after us, and we were terrified of what they would do to us. And I ran into one of these outhouses, and I threw the apples down. And I remember being so angry with myself because the man didn't catch me, but the apples were floating on the dirt. You know, you don't flush it down and they go there. So if anybody had gone in there, they were there. And meanwhile, I lost all these great apples. It's a lesson to learn.
When you think of your identity, how would you define your identity?
Well, I told you before that I think I'm many different people. Today, I was the mother who gave away care packages. Before this, I was the grandmother who was taking care of my grandson. Right now, I'm being interviewed as a survivor. Each one of those is an identity, I guess. I'm Rina. I'm me.
National identity?
National? Excuse me. Too many things.
Do you think the fact that you went through what you went through influenced your involvement in it?
I do. I really think that people help me, and I think that I am in a position now to help other people. So we use our house a lot. We use our house for all kinds of people. We also have a very large extended family of friends, and like this woman who just came, all of a sudden her children are our grandchildren. And the woman who we made a party for yesterday is like a sister. I volunteered to do it. And yeah, we really do look to see how we can help. And we like friends and we like people. So we, as I said, my table is open like this all the time, and I have people over all the time. And my freezer is full all the time so that I'm not caught off guard.
Don't you have time?
Yeah, I do, and sometimes I think I don't want to do it, but thankfully I have a lot of energy, and like if I'd be home today babysitting, if he's sleeping, I could make a soup or a kugel and put it in the freezer and not know when I'm going to use it, but it's always there. So, and you know, being retired, you can do what you want. If I decide tomorrow to go off to except that I have to look at my calendar, because every day has something else doing. Mm-hmm. Last week, it was impossible to go for any place, any day. Now somebody just called me before you came in that they're going to the Hyatt for 2 days. Did we want to go? I didn't even had a chance to talk to my husband about it. She said to call her back today because they're making reservations. So, yeah, but I'm my own free person. I can do whatever I want.
Politically, do you think you're easily shaped by experience?
I'm not sure that they've been shaped by the Holocaust experience. I feel very strongly in Israel. My daughter, whom you just met, lives in one of the settlements near Hebron. It's a settlement that's completely isolated. I'm very much concerned of what's going to happen, so I'm very much to the right. I very worry about Israel, but I think all of us, whether Holocaust survivors or not, have a right to worry.
When they use imagery like in 67 or 73 where we surrounded, you know, the Holocaust, how do you think about those kind of...
Oh, 67 was awful. Because we were living in the United States, and it sounded like there was no Tel Aviv, and there was no more Israel, and I cried bitterly, but again, I think that most of us did. And sometimes I wonder, I've got a lot of mixed feelings about, should all the Jews be in Israel? And in some ways I think, yes, this is where we belong. And the other place, you sort of feel, isn't it dangerous to have everybody one place? If anything happens, we're all wiped out. But when I went back to Poland, and when we were in Russia, we just took a cruise this summer in Russia, and they're talking about revival of Judaism. I don't understand why anybody would want to stay in Poland. I mean, you can't have the same kind of life that we have here, and everybody's welcome to come here. Why not take advantage of it? And then you sort of feel as somebody who's old and who doesn't speak the language, and who has family there, or as intermarried with Christians there, and coming to the unknown is very, very difficult. So I don't know if we can afford to be judgmental about it. But I'm not sure that if I were given the choice of reviving the Polish community there, or encouraging them to come here, I think I would encourage them, very much to encourage them here.
Well, I think, just one last thing, in terms of maybe your life after, were there any events that really made you feel, brought back the Shoah to you, or made you feel it more in your life than at other stages of your life?
I told you the Gulf War was terrible. I seem to have taken it harder than my husband or my children. I was very careful following orders. When they said to go to the sealed room and put on your gas masks, we did exactly as we were told. And somebody came to visit us one day without a gas mask, and I was quite upset because I said, you know what, I don't want to give mine to hers, but how do I sit there if there's anything happening and just let her be without it? And, you know, they what's the big deal about it? Nothing's happening to her. I took it very, very seriously. I told you I stocked up on food galore. Every kind of can that I could possibly buy so that we had for the next few years, but I thought, why take a chance on it? And it just seemed to me a smart thing to do. I thought that people who weren't taking it seriously there, it was very, very frightening. I couldn't understand, you know, like when they gave you the gas masks with anthrax and run to the hospital in case something happens. I said, you know, this is crazy. If anything happens in my house, the doctors in Sharon aren't going to be waiting for me because they're going to be in the same boat. Because I didn't realize that a scud just goes for a small area. It sounded to me like a bomb that just wipes out all of Israel. That's the way I pictured it. It was terribly, terribly frightening.
Did you feel that your family understood your fear?
They understood maybe, but they didn't go along with me. I told you I wanted to take my grandchildren out of the country. I wanted them to have passports. Not all my grandchildren have passports. They just don't think it's that important, and they're not about to leave, and if they have to fight, they're going to stay and fight here. Well, as I said, the adults could do that. There's no way a 2-year-old child is going to fight, and so why keep them here, and why keep their mothers busy with them? Their feelings were very different from mine, and I couldn't explain it to them, and luckily the war didn't last that long that we had to make any decisions. But nobody left, and everybody just took it in stride. And thankfully it was okay. This time, nobody, I guess I didn't take it so seriously either, even with the gas masks.
When you had children?
When I had children?
Did they?
Well, I was really very thrilled. I mean, I had 2 miscarriages before I had children, and the idea that I wouldn't have a family was very, very upsetting, and I didn't know whether I couldn't have or what. The fact that I had children, I think, is just marvelous because it's a continuation, and it's showing Hitler that we are going to reproduce. We're here. We're proud to be Jews, and he didn't succeed. I mean, when I think that God's helped someday these children will be married and have children of their own, it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? That's right. I'm ready for that. I'm ready. First come the bar mitzvahs and the weddings and the yeah. Right.
Anything else you'd like to say?
I don't think so. But if you have questions, you can call me afterwards. We can just continue. Okay. Well, I'm saying sometimes you have to think about whether you remember something, or if you've read about it, or you've been told about it, or your outlook is different, and it's not always clear. It's not always clear cut of what you remember. There are certain sounds, there are certain smells and tastes that you never forget. But specific details of things, you're not quite sure.
For example?
Well, I can remember the smell of the Bergen-Belsen soup. If you pass the back of a restaurant or a sewer, that was that smell. And even if you're dressed up and going to a beautiful place, and you're certainly not thinking of the kind of soup you had 55 years ago, when you smell that, that comes back. I think that's a subconscious kind of deal. But sometimes when you hear of instances, or something in a movie, you say, this happened that way, or did I see it that way?
Can you remember a specific?
Well, in Spielberg's movie, you know, when that the commandant was shooting down at people working. In the glass factory that I worked in, I remember shootings, and I remember the dogs would always, every time they would be let go, they could really maul somebody. I've got some scars where I ran away from a dog. And you say, is this the same dog? Do I remember this dog, or did the movie bring the scene back, or am I imagining it? But there's no way that you can for sure remember, or know that you're remembering or saying it, but it sort of triggers something in you. Cold. Cold is something. Sometimes you go out and you start shivering, and that kind of a shiver is something that you remember always being cold. I don't remember ever being hot, and I'm sure there were hot days, but I just remember the cold all the time. That's a scary kind of cold. And then you say, all you have to do is put on another sweater, another coat, or go inside the house, and you won't be so cold outside. Every once in a while you have to tell yourself that.
Then you know.
No, at that time I can't remember that. But at that time, even if you would tell yourself, it wouldn't help.
And put my sweater on.
No. And I don't know if you had the first sweater. I remember once doing something, sometimes I get scared. I was working in the glass factory, and I was in the barracks with all men. And I was a child, and I had been warned that if the German soldiers would come in, or if anybody would come to inspect, they would try to hide me, and I must keep very, very still. And I guess somebody apparently came in, and a man with a big mustache. Somehow or other, I always think of these people as being my uncles, but I have a feeling that they weren't really biological uncles. And instead of calling somebody Mr. or Mrs., everybody would be an aunt and uncle. And he put me under his feet in his bed with a blanket over it, and he had his feet on top of me. And I was fast asleep. And you know how when you're fast asleep, you don't know what you're doing, and I was moving. And nobody noticed, and they left. But when they left, this man picked me up and started shaking me and said, do you know what you could have, all of us could have been killed because we were doing, and you know how bad you were, and you know how, and I remember feeling so, I was so guilty. I really was bad. I really could have put everybody into danger, and it frightens me to this day of what I could have done, and I had really no control over it. But it was my fault, absolutely my fault. So somebody, sometimes something happens like that, and you, how could I have done that? And sometimes things happen. This morning I was changing the baby someplace, and it was a very narrow ledge, and I kept on saying, stand very close and don't let go for 1 second, because you can think of what can happen. And that's the kind of feeling is you really have to be careful, because you're going to be so bad, you're going to be so, you're going to endanger somebody so much. One time, I think, the Swedish man who gave me a doll, I broke the doll. The leg came out of the socket. And I don't know if I had done anything, but it used to be on rubber bands, like. And I was so scared of that because of what I had done. Because you always have to think of your role in things. I'm not telling you anything now. When I go to these places, if I speak to the people about politics, they're perfectly happy to talk to me. If I talk to them about traveling someplace, if they've gone back to Poland. But if I'm trying to find information, they don't have any. Many of these people, by the way, came to Israel before the war. They came from Ketrika, but they came before the war. They lost a lot of families there. They try to be helpful, but we're on different wavelengths.
Because they want to get over it, or because you're an American?
I think because I'm an American and they just can't imagine. It's very hard for somebody not knowing my story. And of course, when you meet somebody, you can't say, oh, by the way, let me first tell you about myself, and then I'll ask you. Mm-hmm. So it takes a while. And if I go with Naftali Lavie, and Naftali would sort of say, you know, she's looking for something. There's a bulletin that comes out, and I get it very often. And in that bulletin, several years ago, I wrote to the editor and I told her my story, and I said maybe you would print it and maybe somebody would recognize the name. And it's like we never lived. Nobody seems to know us. So, you know, if a whole family was killed and all the neighbors were killed, who's left? There were 15,000 people. There were 15,000 Jews living there. So it's not too likely that you're going to meet your next door neighbor who would have remembered. It was so amazing what the Christian woman remembered.
Amazing. Yeah.
Anyway, we were talking about, so the other thing he talked about as a theme was nature, trees, birds, barbed wire, fences of bodies. Now, I don't think I told you that, but every day in Bergen-Belsen, when we'd get up in the morning, we'd sort of look around to see who died. And of course, an awful lot of people died. And they would be pulled out on a blanket and just dumped with all the other bodies. And there were fences made out of not stone or wood, but bodies. You've seen those pictures of piles and piles of bodies. And that was a normal thing for me. I didn't know that that was not an everyday kind of sight. And you'd go on and on. And apparently when I give testimony, sometimes I talk about the fences and the smell of the bodies and being all around. And at liberation, their bodies all over. And we have pictures of them in Yad Vashem. And he says that, also in Treblinka, there are now trees. Have you been to Treblinka? Mm-hmm. So you know those 17,000 tombstones, but around, as you go through, they're beautiful trees and beautiful forest. And those were all probably grown, fertilized by the bones of people. So when you talk about nature, so he brings that in. Mm-hmm. I don't know how he does it. I haven't seen him, but he says this is what he uses, and in each time I must say different things.
Do you remember losing someone in Bergen? I mean, someone dying and then being taken away from you?
Oh, sure. That mother of mine who stole the black coat, she disappeared, so she must have died. But Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp where people died of sickness and starvation.
Did you feel the loss? I mean, did you feel that?
Somehow or other, I think that was just another thing that happens. It was happening all the time. And if you read books about it, I don't remember my doing this, but if somebody died, you'd put them out, but you would take their shoes, or if they had any leftover bread, or if you had anything else, you'd use that.
Did you ever think I don't want to land up like that? Or did you ever have that consciousness of surviving versus dying yourself?
I don't remember. But I think everybody always wanted to survive. Otherwise you couldn't go on. And when you read about people who are called Muslim, when they've stopped caring, they did die. I mean, I wanted that soup so desperately, no matter how vile it tasted. And bread, whatever, you know, I can't imagine nowadays that anybody would eat moldy bread or drink water from a a pool that people use to go to the bathroom or to wash out or wash their feet in or something like that, and that's same. And how could anybody survive drinking that water? And yet, that's all there was.
You still have an acute sense of smell and...
Yes. My husband says that I'm the only one. I come into the house and I just say there, or I'll see there's something in the refrigerator that doesn't belong, or the gas. I mean, he says that it's amazing, and it's true. I mean, I go into any of the rooms and I can find things very easily too. Like he says, you look in the refrigerator and he can't find anything, or in the closet, and I seem to be able to find. I never thought about it before. Is that something that you build up?
I don't know, maybe either people have a sensitivity to smell, like very strong. It seems to brings you back to the experience. I think smell and memory is something that's uninterrupted.
I have a very keen sense of smell.
It's a very uninterrupted memory, so there's nothing that you can really do to take it away. It's straight registered from the nose.
He laughs about me. He laughs about it all the time. When I say there's something here that doesn't belong there, or this is there, or these socks aren't clean. How do you know they're over here? They're not. I do. Excuse me. I remember when I came to the United States on a ship passing Ellis Island and getting off, and a family picked us up, and there saw these big apartment houses where you may have 20 families living in one, but I believed that each person had a house like that, because I had not, I didn't know any differently. And the schools and the various clothes and food. I mean, this was a totally different experience that I'd never had. And so what it's like going to America from the different backgrounds. And again, he brings this up because his students come from different backgrounds. You have people here come from the Midwest, and you have people here who come from New York and the East, and from religious homes and non-religious homes, and you bring your background into something completely new. And as you come, you see different things around you.
Do you see yourself as an American, Israeli, as a...
I guess I'm both now. I'm both. Everybody in Israel thinks of me as an American. When I go back to America, I'm the Israeli. The next thing that he mentions is belief in God. And what I said to you is that I believe in even if I don't understand. And the role of each generation, the generations before gave it to us, so we must pass it on. Good values, less confusion. Again, coming back to tzedakah and Shabbat, value of living in a community, you and others, and the passing on of previous knowledge. The next topic he talked about is return to Poland. And he felt that it would be an interesting way of starting, because I told him I never know how to start when I have to go to speak to a group. And very often something happens that you'll start that way. Or like the other day I told you, this man introduced me to his Christians, and great, that was a good way. But if somebody just sort of said, I'd like you to meet Rina Quint, then how do you start? And he felt one of the topics is to say, I want to tell you how I learned about myself. And go into it chronologically. Start with first memories of things that you remember before the war and go through, which is pretty much of what I do. So I thought this was very nice that he gave this to me.
Oh, great.
And then here I have also, I took a course of what, I don't know if this is going to help you in any way, but survives questions. If you start with a group is, how many of you have ever met a survivor? So you sort of know, are they grandparents survivors, are they parents? This group of Christians wanted to take a picture with me because they had never met a survivor, and they want to show somebody what a survivor looks like. You know, we think it's funny, but for somebody who's never seen it, I guess it's not so funny. Have you ever spoken to any survivors to ask them personal questions? How many of you would like to meet a survivor? What frightens you most about a survivor? What would you like to ask them? These are questions that you would ask kids. Are most survivors religious or not religious? Why do you think they would be one or the other?
Are there certain questions you're not prepared to speak about?
No. At least I haven't been asked them yet. One of the things that people ask me very often is, do you feel guilty? Because there's this notion that survivors feel guilty. And my answer is that I think I was too young to have done anything to feel guilty about it. I just don't understand how I say, and these better people and smarter people and more educated people did not. But it's not as if I really stole somebody's food so they died, or if I exchanged myself with somebody else, or if I was a prostitute. I mean, or I was a capo. These are the things that you could feel might make people feel guilty. I didn't have any opportunity to be any of these things. That's why, as a child, it's different. Don't you think so?
No, I mean, yeah, and do you think that someone should feel guilty? I mean, if they were a couple.
They might. They might. If you feel that you, I think the story of in the Lodz ghetto, Romkowski, versus in the Warsaw ghetto, Chernikov, yeah, where Chernikov said he was not going to play God to choose the people to go to their death, where Romkowski felt that by doing that he would be saving others. And that speech he made about when he sent off the children, and he said sometimes you cut off a limb to save a life. It sounds good, it makes sense, but you are playing God. Now he also felt because some people feel because of him they are alive, and other people felt that they sent my child away. So you could feel guilty about somebody. If you stole somebody's shoes, and you had shoes, and they were barefoot and they died of pneumonia, you can feel guilty about that.
Do you think though that the guilt, I mean, can you judge that?
No, I think most of the things you can't afford to judge. We have pictures in Yad Vashem where there's a child lying on the floor and people are passing by filled with some things. And you sort of say, how could people just pass by and see this child starving? Well, if you've saved every bit of money you have and you've got 10 children like that waiting for you in your apartment and they're in the same condition, are you going to give to a stranger rather than your own child? And when you see this on every block, you really can't afford to judge these people.
And Romkowski?
I don't know. He really believed that if the Jews would make themselves useful and that the Germans would need them to make their uniforms, that they wouldn't be killed. And he truly believed that. And for a long time it was true. They didn't take off the people. But when he saw that he had to send away the old and the sick, and he knew what was happening. But by that time I don't think he had a choice of doing it. I certainly wouldn't want to judge. How do you feel about it?
See, I'm in a very different position to you in terms of, I don't feel I have any right to judge. I mean, I have no concept of anything of what it meant to be in that period of time at all. So for me, I don't even think about judging them. I do think, I think that Professor Bauer says, there's something that we should avoid in terms of moral bankruptcy, in the sense that there were some people who gave their lives to save people. And Romkowski decided to give over people. Or there was a capo who informed on the Gestapo. Yes, there is different behaviour, and why can't we reward the man who saved or the woman who saved people at the risk of their own life? There is a difference going on between behaviour. So where does the judgment come in? It's a very hard question. I don't think I could judge either case.
I'll tell you, something happened to me recently that sort of maybe something to think about. A friend of mine went to Holland. Her husband was a psychologist, and she went along. There was a conference of some sort. And she came in. She's a religious woman, and she had her hair covered. She was wearing a hat all the time, and they wouldn't travel on Sabbath, and they wouldn't eat non-kosher food. And people weren't very friendly to her, and she felt that there was sort of anti-Semitism. And there was one woman who really sort of snubbed her. And it just sort of turned out that they were always sitting at the same table, and one day she started talking to her, and she said she'd love to see a little bit of the country, and the woman finally sort of said, you know what, I'll take you because I'm going through. Then she got to talking to this woman, and she's, you realize I'm an Israeli, and she says, yeah, I realized that all from the beginning. And she says, you don't like Jews very much, do you? And she says, no, I don't like Jews. They ruined my childhood. And so this friend of mine said, how did I ruin your childhood? And she says, my parents took in Jewish children. And I wasn't going to play with other children, and I had to share my food with them. And my mother had to give more attention to those children than to me because they were in more danger and they couldn't go to school. So when I went to school, they were busy with there, and my whole life was taken over by these Jewish people. And, you know, when you think about this, it did ruin her childhood. It was a different kind of thing than if she could run outside and say, my cousin came to visit me, instead of not being able to say that there are 2 Jewish children hiding in my basement. Never thought of it from that point of view. You just think of these mother and father being, she says, now I realize what my parents did, but at that point, I hated it. It's true. A different perspective. But I would probably feel the same way. You know, if I had 1 lollipop and my mother said, you've got to cut it in 4 because the other children need it, I'd be resentful, wouldn't you? I wasn't allowed to bring any friends into my home in case they would find out. I wasn't allowed to tell anybody about them.
Do you feel that this is that you want to try and do, in your personal understanding how you present yourself, is it trying to, you want to improve your, why?
I don't know why. A lot of people have asked me why. If people ask me to come back, I must be successful in what I'm doing. But I'm always looking for something to make it better. And I also would like to know what is the best way of presenting it to make it interesting and to make people understand and to make people feel.
Why don't you think they do?
I'm not saying that they don't. I'm not saying that they don't, but I guess it's a certain kind of insecurity maybe, or maybe really just wanting to be the best you possibly can. I mean, my husband, I've got the greatest husband, and he thinks I'm terrific. And if I ask somebody for a recipe, why do you need another recipe? You've got so many. But you do want another recipe. You want something different, and you want, I don't know if it's updated. My story won't change. But there's this realization of these Christian people. I never thought about it before, but it's an absolute truth, and you should think about it. And when I told you, Paul Lips told me that I said these things, that he's using it, I didn't think about them until he said it. So you may hear of something that I said, or I didn't say, that you say, you know, you ought to point that out.
But it's amazing that you're so open for it. I mean, that you really want to do.
Oh, I really do. I'm not saying, you know.
No. I'm just wondering why.
That's why when I said to you, if you hear something that you don't like, and you said, why do you want to hear that? I do. If just like I want somebody to say, you know, this piece of furniture would look much better over there than over here. So maybe I'll say, I don't agree with you. Well, you know what? Maybe I'll try it.
But I can't say this has been part of your story I mean, that's your life. It's your story. I mean, what? So it doesn't speak to me because whatever. I'm not going to say.
No, but you could sort of say, you know what? If you describe the Bergen-Belsen soup, or if you tell me how this is, sometimes I take a group on a fast day, and they're hungry. And I say, you know, I know you're hungry, and you think you're hungry, but you really don't know what hunger is. I don't think we know anybody living in Israel now who is hungry and starved. You just can't explain that. I don't think I could explain it now. If I haven't eaten for the day, I know I'm hungry. I'm famished, but it's different than when you haven't eaten for weeks. And what you eat has no nourishment in it. How do you explain that? I guess a good writer could, or somebody with a good, a lot of good adjectives. I've never written my story. And people ask me why I don't have the confidence to write it, and I don't know how to write it. I guess I could get a ghostwriter, but I feel that there have to be so many details filled in, and those have to be so accurate. Carpet is green, the cooling green. We're very often asked by different groups to host tourists or students. And one day we got a call, maybe from the tourist bureau or somebody else, who asked if we could host a group from Westland College, which is apparently a well-known college in California. Most of the students, if not all, were Christian. And they didn't want them to know who we were. We were just hosting them. But they wanted the discussion to be around Israel or Judaism or the Holocaust. And they did not know anything about us, my husband and me. And they came in and we served, drinks and fruit and whatever. And we got to talking and we talked about Israel. And then the subject came about the Holocaust. And I asked if anybody ever met any Holocaust survivors. And a few of them met somebody in school or somebody came to speak. Nobody really knew anybody personally. So I said, what do you think a survivor would be like? What would their home be like? And they said, probably very dark, probably very gloomy, a lot of blacks and grays, and certainly opposite of my home, which is all green and white. And, we just kept on going on, and I didn't tell them. And finally I said, well, what would you say if so and so forth? And they really did find it hard to believe. But we talked a great deal before I told them who I was. And the impressions that people have are very different from what you expect. Then when I told the story to my daughter said, I never thought about it, but maybe the reason you like green is because it does represent life. I don't know. I think I like blue and red also.
It's not grey, it's black.
No.
Interesting. A lot of stories. And I was very interested in the interview that we had. So it was a wonderful interview.
I don't remember very much of it because it's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago. But I've been spending a lot of time looking at it. And I started trying to understand. There was a point which for me was quite revealing in the sense that you spoke about the interview that you had at Yad Vashem, and there was feelings that came from you that I read, that you weren't satisfied with the interview, and it was hard for you on a certain level. And what I did is that I decided to go and look at the interview, because I wanted to see what happened.
My interview.
Your interview.
Oh my, yeah. What do you think?
What had happened to you, for you, there. And it was just, for me, it became a whole study really about what's the difference between giving a witness statement, giving testimony, what is the difference in having a conversation.
What year was that?
89.
Right. So it's 10 years ago.
10 years ago. A long time ago. And it's just a really interesting thing because there's a new book by a man called Henry Greenspan, really on the subject about what's the difference between people, survivors, being questioned, and what is the difference between survivors giving an interview. And I was trying to understand what happened for you then. And
what'd you learn?
Well, for me, it was complicated because I didn't.
deal about this and had a lot of empathy. And as a matter of fact, I invited her to Israel, and her son came and stayed with us. I had never met him before. And, you know, we just had a very nice, it developed a friendship. I had an interview once with Eric Silver, who wrote for the India News. I think it was for the 50th anniversary, and he was just looking for somebody. I had an interview with somebody whom I did not like so much, a lovely, lovely lady who wrote for the Hatzofen. And she had heard about me because we have a large apartment and we do a lot of things on our apartment. And she had heard that we've made weddings for people. And people have said Shiva in our home who felt more comfortable sitting here than in their own home, or maybe they brought the body from the United States and had no place except a hotel, so they stayed here. We've made different things like that. And she heard about this, and she was interviewing me, and she wrote several things that were not correct. I had told her that my mother and brothers were taken to Treblinka, and that I never got to Treblinka. I escaped before the transport was taken there. In the report, she wrote that I escaped from Treblinka. Nobody ever escaped. No child could possibly have escaped from Treblinka. So anybody who reads that would sort of say that either I'm lying or it's just fabricated. So I felt bad about that. And then she wrote that we're very whatever because we make weddings for poor people. People we made weddings were not poor miskenim. They were just nice people who wanted to have an intimate wedding or a wedding in a home rather than there. And I didn't want them to think that I thought that they was, you know, poor or...
Did you say something to her?
I said something to the people. I never met the reporter again. But I said to the people, please, it wasn't my idea.
That's not what I said. Wow. And Spielberg, how was it? Was Spielberg?
It was okay. It was dry. Dry. And then my children were invited to come, and some of them said something, it's nice that I'm alive, and something like that. Nothing spectacular.
You didn't feel that you had... Did he give you something?
No, it was one of these very, very hot days like today, and they wouldn't let the air conditioning go because it made noise on the thing, and the lights were very, very hot, and I had guided in the morning, so I had gone through this, and I don't remember feeling anything.
Second, the other part of the interview which was really interesting for me, which I need your help on, is that when I spoke to you, you spoke about an experience when your uncle told, you didn't give me a date, so I'm not sure the date, he came, an uncle from Pietruco came and said that you had two sisters. And with me, that was really something that you found very disturbing. And then going back, but it was very different in Yad Vashem. Was it different? You said that, as I understood, that you didn't believe him. And you said he's too old and I don't believe him. And for you, the feeling of discomfort wasn't in the interview. It was almost as if you said he's not sure, and that's it. And with me, there was a definite, you discussed more about the fact that you doubted yourself. And this whole idea is very, very, for me, I just find really, really crucial in the sense that I've come to understand a lot from you about being a child survivor and being a person who's looking for their facts and their roots and proof about the missing parts of your life because you were young. And this was really, I thought, an incredibly crucial point in trying to understand for you what that means. And when I saw, that different interpretation for you, I was just like, what's it like for you? Why?
I don't remember what I said to you, and I certainly don't remember what happened in Yad Vashem. But I think that when I had the interview in Yad Vashem, it must have been like a month or two after I came back from Poland, and I found my brother's birth certificate. So there was no doubt in my mind that I had two brothers. I remembered as a little girl that I had two brothers. But even now, there was a time that that if somebody said something like, are you sure you were in Bergen-Belsen, or are you sure you had typhus, are you sure like that? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I think so, and I'm not trying to tell you a lie. But it's so nice to have proof. Like to have proof of my brother's birth certificate, that I could say definitely that they were there. So I do remember feeling very upset, and my husband was upset also when he talked about my sisters, because I knew that I didn't have sisters. But then on the other hand, he is older, and he is wiser, and he probably remembers more. So maybe he knows something. And then when I found them, I knew that I was right. But then how could he be wrong if I'm right, and how could I be right if he's wrong? So I still have that dilemma. So maybe at that time I just was very sure because I found the facts. But even now there are some things, sometimes I say something, and even today, like I told you, and I've told all my other interviewers and myself, that I worked in a glass factory called Hortensia. There is a list that came out of people who worked there, and I've been trying to get a hold of that list. Because even if my name wouldn't be on that list, there's a good chance that my father's name would be on that list, because I was supposed to be in hiding. If his name would be there, then I would know for sure I am. But if his name is not there for one reason or another, then I really don't have proof. And I know that there was another glass factory called Kara. I could have possibly been in that one. It really doesn't make much of a difference of where I was, because both of those factories eventually were closed and the women sent off to Bergen-Belsen. But I would like to know it as a fact. So there are a lot of things still there that that I'm not sure about. You know, like if I say I had typhus or typhoid, I don't know which one. I'm not a doctor, can't remember, but I remember hearing this, that everybody had it, and I know when I got to Sweden I was sick from these things. But I don't have proof. I don't know if I ever will have proof. So I think I still have a lot of doubts. And sometimes I say, how do you know the thing that you're saying? And I try so hard to remember these things. And I know without having solid, but you know, many things that happen in your life you don't have solid proof of.
It's become more difficult for you?
No, I don't think I don't know. I don't really think about it very much. But, you know, I guide in the Tower of Date Museum. And if I'm not there for a while, and I say a date, like Constantine was the emperor in 330, I said, how do you know that? And then I go to a book and I said, oh, I read it. It's not that I was there to know it. You can verify things. And sometimes I asked myself, how do you know that fact? So the same thing, like, if I'll say to you about your husband, you once told me about your husband, that some things you can verify and some things you just can't. And for me, the things that I don't remember, I would love to be able to completely verify.
Why?
It would just prove to me that that it's an absolute truth. It wouldn't make any difference in my life. Every time I read about these slave laborers getting compensation or getting compensation for homes, maybe my parents owned a house, or maybe if not my grandparents did. I have no proof. Maybe if I would hire detectives and go through this, maybe I would, and maybe I wouldn't. I don't really want to that much, but it would be nice if somebody came. Probably since the last time I met you, I met a woman who did some research for me in Yad Vashem and found that I had 3 uncles. Now, I never knew I had 3 uncles. How did she find out? She's much more clever and adept at doing research than I am. And when she looked at my birth certificate and my parents' marriage license, she found out my father's parents' names. My grandmother and grandfather from the paternal side. She was looking for my father in Buchenwald and in other places to see what possibly could have happened to him, because I don't know what happened to him, except that he never came back after the war. And she found 3 other men who had the same last name, whose parents had the same names, who lived approximately in the same area, and who were all tailors. So putting that together, she says those were my uncles. Probably right, but it could be that there were other people who had the same name, or maybe cousins or something like that. It makes no difference in my life now, but it's an interesting fact. Now, maybe had I known this 50 years ago, maybe one of those people would have survived. So to answer these questions to you, I don't know why it makes a difference. Do you find many survivors are looking for things? I think it's like adopted children who want to know but are afraid of knowing, and for years records are closed.
Okay, people want to know their past. I think there's an absolute, and I think your interview impressed me so much that I decided that that's what I really want to look at. I really want to look at to the survivors because of this whole need or this want to find their past. And what is it?
There's so many things. I went to the doctor the other day, and he's sending me for a whole cholesterol, their new tests that they're doing, and new pills that they're doing, and they said, if you know that there is no family history of cholesterol or heart disease, then you're not so prone. But if you don't know it, you might be on that. So it's a good idea to find out this and this and this. I don't have any of the answers when they ask me these questions. Neither one of my parents or brothers lived long enough to develop heart problems or cholesterol that I would have known about. And these are questions that I'll probably never know the answers to.
When do you think there's any point that you think that you felt that this started becoming important for you to do? I mean, there was a period in your life when you were really...
Well, until 1981, I just didn't talk about the Holocaust. My adopted parents never discussed it. People never approached the topic. In 1981, there was a gathering of Holocaust survivors, and at that point I decided to come and search. And at that point I wrote to Arleston, and I wrote to Sweden, and to all the other places, and that's when I found. And then in 89 I went back to Poland, and I found a lot. So I guess since 81 I've been more. And since 84, when we made Aliyah and I started working in Yad Vashem, I've been much more involved with the Holocaust in general. Not just on my own Holocaust, but in general of what happened.
Anything specific in 1981, I mean, that you...
There was a gathering of Holocaust survivors. I went looking. There were computers that you were supposed to be able to look for people, and I couldn't find anybody in my family, and not myself. And somebody told me that the computers only have information that's fed into it, and since nobody fed anything into the computers, I'm not going to find it. And I realized that I'm probably the only survivor who could find it. So my husband and I went really on a searching expedition, and we found a lot. I mean, I probably told you, as I said, I don't remember our interview, but I found, I have a letter from Sweden that tells me exactly the date I came to Sweden, when I left Bergen-Belsen, how long I was in the hospital in Sweden. When I left Sweden, I found in New York the boat I came from, which I don't remember, but I know the exact name of the boat that brought us to Manhattan. I know the man who sponsored us, and the family who, took care of us, and I know that family who brought me over to the people who adopted me later on. So all this I know now as facts, where I have written documents.
I just think that I'm trying to understand. In 1981, there's a Holocaust survivors reunion, and you decided to come. What really made you want to be involved? Why then did you decide? I mean, was it just?
First of all, it was the first reunion, so all of a sudden there was a chance for it. And also my youngest child, my son, was in the 8th grade, and they had a unit to learn about the Shoah, and they asked if anybody knew of a survivor. And my son raised his hand, and he said his mother, and his teacher didn't really believe him because she knew me, and she knew my husband even better because he was chairman of the Board of Education, and she called to say that David always seems to know what to say, and he said something that didn't quite jive, and he said something about you being concentration camp. And she says, she was an Israeli, so she spoke with an accent, and she thought that I was the typical American without an accent. And I said, no, he was right. And she asked me to come to speak, and it was the first time that I really spoke publicly to a whole assembly. And my adopted mother was in the audience, and it was very, very moving and very difficult. It's gotten much easier since. I mean, I can speak about it much easier now. So I guess all that led to it.
It's quite a moment.
Yeah. Tell me more what you found from the two.
Well, there was I was trying to look for the place where you felt your discomfort with the interview, and it was difficult. There was one point that she dropped the camera, and there was some discussion about what was going on. It seemed to be a bit confusing at some point, and I thought maybe that was the point. And it was very long. Like I remember you saying to me there was 7 hours. I mean, videotape.
Because they stopped it 7 times. He was a professional photographer, and every time an important person came, he went to take their pictures and came back. And then you had to get back into the mood.
So I think there was. I could sense that there was, difficulty in there. I just, for some reason, I just found, I thought she was actually. I thought she was quite competent. I mean, I don't like necessarily saying, well, where were you then and where would you go? I mean, that's just for me something that I'm trying to work away from. But that's what I was trying to concentrate. How does that method affect you? Or in the situation where I say, tell me about your life, where you really create your own dialogue as opposed to her. And I just felt, the more I see it, I just feel that a more open-ended conversation is much more constructive. And I got that from the interview. Although I thought she was particularly okay. I just couldn't sense your angst, and I didn't know how you felt.
I guess it wasn't bad. I just didn't find her very sensitive. I know her personally now, and I've met her, and she gave a talk at the Steven Spielberg series, which I was going to do interviews. I never did. And I think Israelis are just they're just not as sensitive. They just don't feel your pain or your happiness with you. It's just a job. Do you know the person?
I do know the person. I know. I mean, I did a course with her once. I think she's very affected by it. I think she's not. She went overseas for a while. She's not in Israel for a while.
Well, maybe you know what? A lot of people in Yad Vashem, after a while, it gets to be a job. And I think when it gets to be a job and you lose sensitivity to it, it's time to move on to something new.
Look, definitely, I could sense her distance. I just felt that I really wanted to stay where you were because it's important for me because I want to understand what's happening for you. That I just wanted to, I wanted to come back and ask you because it just.
No, I can't even remember it. I mean, I've never looked at the interview. I've never really looked at the Spielberg interview. I hope they send me the right one, the right person, because my children and grandchildren are on it. But it just didn't.
Interesting. There was nothing other than that. I mean, there was. I think you were very strong in the interview. I think you were very powerful. I was very moved by you. It was an amazing testament to you, the interview, which I found it's great that I said everything and people can listen to you in the future because I think it was really very moving. It was very.
I just met somebody in New York. I was at a wedding, and she came over to me and she said, "You're Rina Quint," she says, "I have you on video." And apparently, I gave a tour to a bar mitzvah group, and I spoke about my life first, and they recorded the whole thing, and they show it over and over and over. Now, I had no recollection, but she knew all the words I used, and she was introducing me to all these different people. It made more of an impression on her than on me, and then she says, "It's the way you started it." Now, I forgot how I started it, because I don't always start the same way. I never know how I'm going to start, and depending who the group and how you're introduced and what happened just before or yesterday or something like that. But apparently in that interview, it was a group of children, and the elders were the bar mitzvah boys, and the parents wanted them to go there, and I said, how would you feel if you didn't know how old you were? And they started to laugh, and I said, how would you feel if you didn't know your name? And they all thought it was funny, because everybody knows how old they are. what your name is. And I said, I really didn't know how old I was and what my name was, for a while. I haven't started that way for a long time. Maybe it's a good way to start.
There? Yeah, great. Amazing. How do you feel about being this witness? I mean,
I think that I should do it, and I must do it, because I think that anybody who remained alive really remained alive as a miracle and owes it to the people who did not. And when you hear about Holocaust deniers and revisionists who try to tell the world that this didn't happen, you have to have people like me who are living a normal life to say, it wasn't always normal. It really did happen. And I'm not doing it to prove history or to get money or for the state of Israel. I'm doing it because this is what happened. And you have to get it, and it's easier to hear it from somebody than to read a history book. And so I think it just has to be told and told and told over and over and over. And I think every survivor probably should.
do you think society has changed in its perception of survivors?
Oh, yes. I mean, we've heard that many times, that when people came here in 48, nobody wanted to hear the stories about the war. They had their own wars. If you survived the Holocaust and you came to Israel, and then everything was fine, and then your son went on the battlefield and was killed here, this war was worse for you than that war, because this is the war where you lost your child. So they didn't want to hear what happened then. Let's work on what's happening now. And I think people didn't understand, you have no one to invite to a party, you don't have a relative, you don't have a past. And nobody wanted to live with it. And now people are much more understanding of it. And I think they do want to hear it. I think I was told that the Eichmann trial caused a great change in me.
Do you feel this towards yourself?
Oh, I think people are very interested, yes. I'm asked all the time to speak to young groups. Also the question of why do you want to stay Jewish or why do you want to stay religious always comes up, especially with non-religious groups or non-Jewish groups, because it's so much easier to just pretend you're not Jewish so you wouldn't do this. Also sort of people feel, living in Israel, if anything happens, all the Jews are in one little area. Isn't it better to be in different places? There's a lot of this kind of discussion. I also have this feeling that I'm very lucky to be Jewish and to be part of a Jewish culture and a Jewish religion. And people who are not part of it, and with so much assimilation and intermarriage, I feel that we're helping Hitler win his cause. He wanted to get rid of all the Jews, and people who are intermarrying and assimilating the Jewish people are getting less and less. And I think this is something to talk about, and it comes up when you talk about Holocaust survival of the Jewish people.
I'm just so fascinated about how people, move into a new world, into a new life, and rebuild themselves, their lives. It's just the most. As hard to understand the Holocaust is, I couldn't.
Yeah, I find it hard also. But then you see some people. A young woman just called me now. She wanted to talk because she's going out with a 43-year-old second generation, and he's not ready to get married, and she blames it on the fact that his mother is a Holocaust survivor, and she's keeping him tight, and he feels he owes her something like that. So I guess not everybody has gone over and continued, and some people just leave it, Sometimes somebody is sick, and with the sickness they can carry on and pretend that everything is okay, and other people take that and live with it the rest of their lives. I guess it depends on your personality and the position you put into it.
Do you think there's a difference in people who were children during the Holocaust versus people who were older?
Yeah, I imagine there probably is. I don't know statistics. You probably know that much better than I do. But I really started a whole new life I mean, I was 9.5 at the end of the war. So I was able to get a whole education, I was able to get a whole family, I was able to get a whole new outlook. The education I got was the same as any American child. I just had to do it faster. And then I went through a regular teenage cycle of being a teenager, of having parties, of going to roller skating and ice skating and dating and good parts and bad parts and engagement and marriage and all that. People who lost those teenage years and who lost their education and who lost their family, they also knew what they lost more than I did. And when you read about, I was just watching CNN and this man buried his 2 children. And when you think about this mass grave and his 2 children, this happened just a few weeks ago, how could he live that down? And he knew what was happening. Whereas a child who saw other things, I think it might be easier to forget. I think. I'm not sure. What do you think?
I think there's a sense of, when you have something to compare it to, I think it might be easier.
Might be easier?
To move on, in the sense that, you know, the disappointment of loss, and then you know, to compare what you're going through to compare what you had, and then I think there's a much bigger gap when children were much more, I think, adaptable. I think the experience of life was much shorter, and therefore they didn't have maybe expectations or the philosophy or the, you know, I just think they were more adaptive. And I'm just trying to work out if that translates to adaptation after for people because they were children, were then able to move into it quicker. I'm not sure. It's interesting. Maybe it had to do with if they were adopted by nice people or not nice people, if they were adopted at all, if they grow up, you know.
If you interview child survivors who came to kibbutzim here, I've gone to several, you know, of these meetings, days like that, and many of them feel that they never belonged then and they still don't belong now. And even though they married and had new families, they had to start everything. There was nothing in their background. And then as people get older and they lose their spouses, I think they feel that loneliness so much more. I think that's why many organizations like Amcha, and when I know I was in England, they have these groups for survivors to come to, just to talk, support groups, I suppose.
Did you ever feel you needed a support group?
I don't know if I needed it, but I find it interesting when I get together with people. You don't always fall into the category correctly. People who lost their families never regained their families. I got a whole new family. Also, the people who came to Israel who were poor living on the kibbutz, when they got married, they didn't have anybody to buy them a house or make them a wedding. I mean, the kibbutz did, but if they would ever want to go on their own, they were on their own. Whereas I really had a backup. I had American parents who were able to make a wedding for me and help me establish a home. Even something like buying dishes, you know, the things that you do. And so when you speak to people who were brought into a kibbutz, they also feel that it's different having come to Israel and having come to the United States. Compared to myself, I went to the United States and I lived a totally American life. I'm sure it would have been different had I stayed in Germany or in Sweden or in Israel or maybe Australia people went to, South America. And each one of them had different connotations, different ways.
No, it's an individual, everyone's got their own issues, their emotions, their coping strategies.
But it's a family also. Wherever you were born in England?
South Africa.
In South Africa. And if your parents had When did you leave South Africa?
87.
87. Okay, so you're already pretty grown up. Suppose you had left when you were 4 years old. You'd be a different person, growing up differently. Your environment, I think, plays a very... I've never known the answer, which is more important. I've thought about that also, my environment or my genetic makeup. Who am I because of what my biological parents gave me or my adopted parents? How do you separate one from the other?
I mean, if you feel things that you're connected to with your biological parents, and you feel, well, that's, I can see myself in them, or they can see them in me, or...
I don't remember anything about them. I don't know.
Or your adopted parents who say, is there something that's going on here that I can see myself in, traits or habits or attitudes?
I imagine there must be, but I don't know which is stronger. Somebody learns to play the piano well. Is it because they got it from their genes, or is it because they were brought up in a home where everybody played music and you were just forced to take piano lessons and to practice and to do?
It's one of the great psychological debates in the nature of the nature.
I don't know the answer.
You're okay with not finding, ultimately, all the facts or the proof that you
Well, I
want?
have to be okay. I mean, it's not a matter of... I'd like to find as much as I possibly can. I'd love to find a fact that my parents owned the apartment, or my grandparents owned the apartment, or even if I don't get the money, just to know, exactly where they live. But I'm not about to go looking for it, that's right. I'd love to know little facts about them, cute stories of what happened, what their life was like. But I don't fool myself at all to find that out. If for 54 years I haven't found anybody who knows these things. And the man that you told me, this uncle who told me about my sisters, he used to tell me things, and then after he told me about my sisters, I sort of decided that all the other stories, I'm not sure that they're accurate or not. Like somebody once told me that I came from this aristocratic family. Well, something, that's a term. That what does it mean? Does it mean that they had good manners, that they were very rich, that they were very educated? It's a personal kind of thing. So it's sort of nice to hear, but you can't take it very seriously.
Are you in contact with this uncle of yours?
I think he may have died now. I was in contact with him for a long time, and I think I told you his son moved to the United States. And while he was in the United States and we were there, we did get together quite often. He's not at all observant, and we invited him to our home for Passover, which was an experience for them, and we made a bar mitzvah for them, which was very nice. And then we moved to Israel, and they stayed there. So every once in a while we're in touch, but it's not a close relationship. I have this other cousin who went to Venezuela, these are both cousins because my mother had several sisters, and these were children of her sisters. So this uncle was an uncle through marriage, who was married to my aunt. That's why I said he may have thought of it, one of the other sisters having two daughters.
Did the aunt die? Sure.
I don't even know her name, or
She didn't speak about it.
Oh, well, one of them, the one from Venezuela, his mother was killed, and he buried her right at the end of the war in Pietrika, which is our hometown. And he went back a few years ago and brought her bones to Israel.
Wow.
He lives in Canada now. I'm in touch with him.
Wow.
It's a woman who's coming here in about 3 weeks, who comes from Pietrika and who was in Sweden the same time I was, and probably went through similar things. And we've met a few times, and she called me from England that she's coming in, and she's going to stay with us for a while, so we'll catch up on things. I'm not really expecting to learn new things, but when you ask me, am I interested in talking about it? Yes, I guess I am. If you want to meet her, her name is Mala. It was her brother is Ben Helfgott, who's the head of Yad Vashem in England, and her name is Mala Helfgott Tribish.
How did you make the contact?
There is a magazine that comes out about Pietrikov. I once wrote to them when I found out about it, sort of looking for people who might know about me. And an article was published. And then this Ben Health guy, I spoke to several people through that article. I met them. And then Ben Helfgott came here for an international seminary in Yad Vashem. And eventually I met him. So we got to know each other. And then a few years later, I don't remember exactly how I met, but I found out about his sister. And we met, and there was a reunion of children who had been in Bergen-Belsen in one of the blocks. And there was a reunion of one group that went to Holland. They stayed in Bergen-Belsen when it was a DP camp. And then many of them went to Holland. They had a reunion. I wasn't part of that group either, because I left Bergen-Belsen in July of 45. Bergen-Belsen was liberated in April of 45. So I was one of the first groups of sick people who were taken to Sweden. That's why I said that everybody has their own little group that they belong to, and I don't seem to have belonged to anybody. Because when I was in Sweden, I was part of the group, and then I left for the United States because I was adopted by a family there, and then in the United States I went someplace else. I was always separated. But I met her, and then she introduced me to some other people who had been in Bergen-Belsen and who had come from Pietrikov and wound up in Sweden. And I think I told you I have a list of survivors of Sweden, and I have a list of survivors of Bergen-Belsen. So it would be interesting to get those people together once.
Will be. I was reading something, I took me back trying to remember things. Do you remember what you wore in Bergen-Belsen?
No, somehow or other I remember one of the things that I probably told you about that stands out very vividly is that when we came out of the showers, this person who became my new mother stole a black coat. That made a very, very big impression because that coat kept us warm. And somehow or other I just remember an old bag kind of, I don't remember any kind of uniforms, but I remember that black coat. And I do remember when we got to Sweden, I met a woman who claimed to have been my cousin. I don't know what happened to her. And she knitted a blue sweater with white reindeers, you know, the kind of design that they used to wear in Sweden. I remember that. And then the woman who adopted me when she brought me to the United States, I had a green pants outfit and a red dress outfit to come to the United States that I was able to wear on the ship. I remember Bergen-Belsen.
Do you ever have an object that you had wheeled away?
No, the anything from Pietrikov to Sweden. Nothing. Nothing from the camps. When I went back to Pietrikov, I was hoping that in the apartment there would have been something, but there wasn't.
Did you know?
I asked the woman, I really offered her money, American money, if there was something in the apartment, and she claims there wasn't. The only thing I should have taken, probably told you that, was the mezuzah that was on the door, and I have pictures of it, but I didn't take it.
Was this getting easier with time, or has it become, has it compounded more for you, or become more difficult?
No, it's easier to talk about it. And as I said, I have more facts that I can prove. It's probably easier.
Did that seminar at Yad Vashem help you? Was it useful with Moshe Harel, the psychologist, and Abraham?
I don't know, I guess he wanted you to be able to speak to groups or to speak to your family. And I'm able to do that, so I guess it was to some extent.
And the people around, did you feel good with their...
I did feel good with them because they made me feel very good because they all had stories and they were typical survivor stories, and they treated me differently because I was the only one who was a child, and they sort of took me like under their wing because I was still their child, even though by now there's no difference in our ages. But they were all older, and they found it hard to believe that a child could have survived. I find it hard too.
It's very rare.
Yeah, I mean, this man kept on talking to me and being part of me, and he said, you could have been my little sister. And I guess he was sort of hoping I would be his sister, and I would have liked him to have been my brother. And very often I look at people and I say, he looks familiar. Could he possibly be my brother? And that somehow or other you always have that hope.
Can you explain it?
Yeah, there's hope. You just never give up. If you know that somebody was killed, if you know that they were buried, you know that they're not alive. But everybody thought I was killed and I was buried and I am alive, so why couldn't they be alive?
Some amazing stories of people finding each other.
Sure.
Amazing. I was in Warsaw now, and this is a man who helps people find the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. He helps people find their relatives, their identity. Amazing to tell the stories of people.
Oh, well, so that's what you say. You just don't give up, and there is always that feeling. Even though in your mind you really say, come on. But it's possible.
More with your children about it than you did?
No, my children really aren't that interested. My grandchildren are more interested. My daughter just asked me to take some of my other grandchildren with their friends, and I've taken several of them to Yom HaShoah. And every Yom HaShoah, in Israel also there's more talk about it, especially on Yom HaShoah where they have to write reports of a survivor or family background or something like that. So the children, the grandchildren asked, the children really, they're really not that interested. So many other things to talk about.
Sure are. Else you want to?
No. I'd be very interested to read your two comparisons.
Well, I actually have for you, if you want, I've got a copy of the transcription of the first interview we had. So you can...
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And then if I find my Yad Vashem interview, or my Imperial War Museum, or any of the others.
Yeah.
One of the nice ones I told you that I had, the one with the teeth, was somebody by the name of Fanny Gorowitz.
Mm-hmm.
She works for the Spielberg Foundation now, and she's working in the Heritage Museum in New York. And she had a very nice way about it. I can't remember some. But, sometimes people just interview you without you knowing their names. And very often students do, because they have a term paper to write.
On you?
Well, it's something to deal with the Holocaust.
How does your husband react to all of this?
My husband is great. He thinks everything I do is just wonderful. So, as I said, I'm involved with Yad Vashem and speaking about the Holocaust now. So very often I'll come home and he say, okay, this person called for this appointment and that appointment. And he thinks it's great. It's like I'm making a business. And of course, everything we do, both he and I are volunteers. But I was supposed to have a Ramah camp this Friday, and they canceled. And he says, okay, I guess this week we're not working as much or something like that. He's very good about it. I think he's just, I guide in Yad Vashem and I guide in Migdal David. He's just as proud of Migdal David as Yad Vashem. I don't think it would make a difference if I'd be there or the Supreme Court, let's say, or someplace like that. It's just nice if you're doing something that you like doing and you feel you're doing something for other people. And I enjoy doing it.
You're very good at it.
I hope so. I guess I'd always like to get better, but the fact that people call you back, like Eish HaTorah, I had 8 groups with them this summer. Now, if they didn't like me, they'd call somebody else. Of course, the fact that I'm free might help too.
How do you think being religious has helped you? Or has it helped you? I mean, that's sort of
I'm sure it has, but I have no comparison to tell you had I not been religious, because it's not as if I wasn't and I became. I think we're more religious now just because we're in this group and our children got more religious, things like that. But we have a very, very Jewish life. Friday night in Shabbat is always a beautiful meal where either we go out or we have it at home. It's really prepared. It's a holiday. It's a holiday each time. Holidays come around, we have a lot of company, or we're invited out. It's a large extended family. Most of our friends are either from the synagogue or the organizations that we belong to, and many of those are connected religiously. Like I belong to Amunah, which are religious Zionist groups. I think one of the reasons we came to Israel is because our children were part of B'nai Akiva, which is a religious Zionist group, and they sort of emphasized Aliyah, and our children always said that they wanted to come. I don't think if I would have been not a religious Jew that I really would have ever come to Israel. I mean, I read in today's paper that like 78% of the Jews have never been to Israel. So you go there as a touring place. Well, we like going touring, but how often do you come back to the same place unless it has a meaning? And we're thrilled that we're living in Israel. We just came back from the United States and had a lovely time when we were there, but when we came back, we were so glad to be here. It really is a nice feeling. I think I told you probably in my first interview that I have a friend in Haifa, and she told me that the person who brought me to the United States had asked her first, but she was waiting to find her mother and her brother, whom she did find, and so I came to the United States instead. Had I not been adopted and brought to the United States, I probably would have been brought to Palestine in 47, 48. So I guess I was always meant to be here.
And do you think it helped you deal with the Holocaust? Or the loss, or
What, coming here?
religion?
You know, I can't tell you, Sharon, because I was brought up by an observant family. And this was the way life was all the time. I was brought up by these people. We ate kosher. We went to the synagogue. We celebrated the holidays. I was taught Hebrew. If I had been adopted by this Christian man who wanted to adopt me in Sweden, I may very well have been a very good Christian. I'll never know that. Again, I told you, if your parents had taken you from South Africa and brought you to Argentina, and you'd been brought up in that culture, you'd been a different person than you are. Maybe the home would have been the same, but the surroundings are different.
Just about the whole idea of God, or the idea of, I don't know, just in helping you to understand or come to terms, or even, I don't know, about the pain. Just that whole idea, that concept of...
I think I must have told you that I can't understand how God let this happen. But I also feel that God wanted me to survive. Why? I don't know. But I could not have survived had he not wanted me to. And I believe very firmly in God. And I think it makes me a happier person, a fuller person, in believing in God. But again, I think that the way I was brought up, had I been brought up by atheists, would I have rebelled and gone on my own saying I believe in God? Who knows? No, but if I would have a choice now to bring in a new baby, to say to believe in God or not, be religious or not, I would want very much to teach that baby to believe firmly, to keep the kind of life. I mean, this is the life that I would choose. And I do choose it. And I'm happy with it. And it makes me feel very good when we have irreligious people come here on a Friday night. And And we don't tell them what they have to do or not do, but they end and say, you know, this is, I've never been on a Friday table like this, and it is special. It is special. You put out your best tablecloth and your best silverware, and there is a difference the way we eat on Friday night than when we eat on Monday. Monday everybody is rushing and going through, and if you take something fast, Friday night is always a leisurely, full holiday meal. And we sing a lot of songs, and we discuss a lot of things, and you talk about everyday mundane things, and you also bring up what Bible portion you read and what we've learned through things. And people who come here always said, I'm so glad that we came because it's something. And we try to invite people. And very often we're called. We got a call this week from Jeff Seidel. Do you know him?
Mm-hmm.
He has a young boy and a mom and pop, he said. I had 19 people, so I couldn't take any more. But this is the way our home is. And then sometimes you have other people, Christian people or religious, and we don't in any way try to get them to do what we're doing. But it's nice that they go away feeling that this was beautiful.
Judaism is caught, not taught. Judaism is caught, not taught.
Oh, right. But we don't even try to throw it to them to catch it. Just, this is what we do. You know, if you're coming into our home, it's just like if you go into a home where everybody's playing music and you come in and everybody's sitting around, or you're just part of it. But we really have had some nice experiences. We've had a young doctor staying here. He stayed here because his aunt asked if we put him up because he was a young doctor, didn't have very much money, totally irreligious, assimilated, having gone to medical school, where at the end we found out that he once came from a kosher home and his father was a Holocaust survivor, but after he went to medical school he lost all kinds of things, and he didn't realize how nice it was until he came. And by the time he left, he says, you know what, I think when I get married I'd like to have a Jewish home. And so when he left, my husband said, okay, when you get married, you tell us and we'll see. And sure enough, about a year later, he called us that he was getting married to a Jewish girl, not a religious girl, and invited us, my husband, to be the rabbi. We couldn't go to the States, but we said, you know what, you get married there and then come here. You can have your honeymoon in our home and we'll make a big Sheva brachot for you. And they did.
Wow.
They came here. We had like 42 people for them, and they keep a kosher home. And they started a study group, and they sent another couple, 2 doctors, who also decided to keep a kosher home. And he said he just saw the beauty of it. I think it also makes marriage more beautiful. There's a lot of respect and give and take, you know, and that kind of thing. And he just decided, and we really feel that we influenced him in that way.
It's a big compliment.
It is a big compliment, and hopefully someday he'll be a very big doctor. I mean, he's successful now. When he came here, he just finished medical school, and you know, when you first start, you've got a lot of loans, you can't do it. They're doing very well. They have 2 children right now, and maybe had he not spent those 2 weeks over here, he could have married a Christian girl. I mean, he never thought about it before.
Amazing. For shared.
Yeah. So that makes me feel good. So when you ask me how I feel about my Judaism, I'm glad. I'm happy. If you ever want to come to us on a Friday night and see what we're talking about.
I'd love to.
Okay? You tell me when.
I'd love to. It'd be my pleasure.